Oh, okay. Yeah, so I'm sorry, everyone, but we'll start a little late because the last session ended very, very late. So we'll start at 1:45 and keep dragging the 15 minutes that we started with this morning. Sorry about that. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for not taking a nap after lunch. We appreciate it. We're 10 minutes late, and I'll chat a little bit so that people can still come in and not miss the speakers. So I'll come up with things to say, or I'll speak slowly, or I'll say everything twice. We'll see. So we're in the first afternoon panel of the first day. It's a panel on leadership of women migrants. And if you don't know what that means, then that's good, because that's what we're going to try to explore together. And it is a great privilege and pleasure for me to introduce you to this cutting-edge panel that tackles a fresh, hardly ever explored intersectionality of gender, migration, and leadership. Over the last decades, we've witnessed growing research and public discussion of women migrants, women leaders, and leadership among migrants. And I don't know if you got a chance to see, but there's this beautiful brochure that was prepared by the people at the EUI with lots of statistics about women leadership. So you can just grab a copy. It's handed out free, and it's full of all the information that you want to know, such as we're doing 100 times better than we did 20 years ago, but that still means that we're only 5% of whatever, right? So all these statistics have a good and bad aspect to them, depending on whether you woke up in an optimistic mood today. So the speakers on our panel have undertaken a heroic challenge. They embark on the groundbreaking conceptualization of the uncharted terrain of leadership of women migrants. They raise and confront the questions, is there such a thing as leadership of migrant women? Can you hear me clearly? Okay. What can it possibly mean? What does it look like? What are the means by which it develops? Is women migrants' leadership in any way parallel to men's? And if not, should we even be speaking of leadership? Or perhaps we should focus on themes that are more appropriate to women migrants. So because I want to take another extra minute or two to allow people to come in, I will share with you that while thinking about this topic, which I'd never tackled before, and I've been doing women's studies for, I don't know, more years than I care to admit, maybe 30. So I've never heard of the issue of women migrants' leadership. And I started thinking in all directions, and there was nothing to read about it. And then I went back and thought about my own grandmother, who was a migrant, and I never thought of her as a leader in any possible way. I mean, she was a housewife, and she cooked, and she kept the house clean, and, you know, she was a nice lady, but I never thought of her as a leader. And then I thought, you know, she migrated when she was 21 years old. It was 10 years after the First World War and 10 years before the Second World War. She came to a country that she didn't know the language of, she wasn't familiar with the customs of, she didn't know anything about anything. And other than finding my grandfather and getting married and, you know, keeping house and trying to make food out of the nothing they had at the time, oh, there we go, we have more people coming in. You can join us. I'm telling stories to pass the time. So, she decided that she was going to do two things. She was going to bring the rest of her family because she decided Eastern Europe wasn't a safe place. And she was going to make sure that her children get education. And it sounds trivial and obvious to all of us today. But in the 1920s, given that she was a 21-year-old migrant, this was ridiculous, right? This was beyond belief. And she went far enough in following her vision that she actually divorced her husband, my grandfather, to send him back to Europe to marry her younger sister and bring her back as a bride. She was a determined lady. And when she wanted to send my father, who was her firstborn, to school and didn't have the money for it, She went to work as a cleaning lady behind my grandfather's back because he would not be thrilled about this. This would have said something about his capacity of, feeding the family. And she made sure that my father would go to high school and then to university. She paid for it and so forth. So, I know these stories my whole life, and I never thought of this as any kind of leadership. But now having to ask myself, what is migrant women's leadership? I'm thinking, this might be a case in point, because what she ended up doing was making a big change, not just for herself, but for the whole community, for the country that she immigrated to. She made sure that her whole family moved from Europe to a new country. She made sure that the next generation would be educated, and she did it while she continued to be a housewife and, cook and clean and so forth. So this is what the panel today is going to be trying to talk about. They're not all going to be talking about my grandmother, but they're going to be talking about different migrant women in different places, different times, and they're not all that different from my grandmother, because they all face the predicament, of being disempowered in their new communities and then trying to do something. Okay, so I think I've told enough stories. Let's go back to the panel now. So our first four speakers are young and mid-career women scholars, all currently affiliated with the EUI, and they will present diverse perspectives of women migrants' leadership, demonstrating both the unique features of different types of such leadership and also their general common denominator. Our last speaker is an honorable member of the European Parliament and a member of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, who will offer us comments from her unique point of view. I'm going to give you a brief overall of just one or two sentences of what each of the panelists is going to say, so that since they're each going to be talking about a very different topic, I want to give you sort of the overall picture of how it adds up together. So I'm just framing and contextualizing it all together for you, not to steal the show from them, just to make it a little easier to follow what they're saying. So Irina Isakian, a research associate at the Cultural Pluralism area in the Global Governments program, explores how American women immigrants to Italy and Greece develop leadership through enterprise. Her analysis of 60 interviews demonstrates how sometimes women who migrate simply because they followed their husbands can find empowerment and even leadership by establishing their own commercial enterprises. Francesca Scrini is a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow and a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the Global Governments program, and she will present 3 cases of migrant women who overcame their marginalization, through church activism. So many women migrants to Europe are members of evangelical churches. Some find in this religious affiliation the means to achieve a sense of leadership, even when their social, economic, and familial status is reduced through immigration. Sabrina Marchetti, a research associate at the Global Governance program, will speak of a research of internal women immigrants in India, who develop leadership in the struggle to improve work conditions of domestic workers. Many women immigrants find themselves isolated and exploited in the homes of wealthier employers. Some rise from these difficult circumstances to public leadership that is both class and gender empowering. Vanessa Grotti is an EUI professor as well as the director of the EU Border Care Project. Her research focuses on immigrants' undocumented maternity and health care. Based on her research, she will question whether leadership is indeed an appropriate theme, and she suggests that perhaps the academic search for leaders might put women migrants in harm's way, whereas the more appropriate themes to consider are solidarity, empathy, and dignity. Last but not least, Daniela Ayueto is a member of the European Parliament in the group Europe for Freedom and Direct Democracy and a member of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. She will share with us her insights on women migrant leadership as she encounters it in her parliamentary capacity. Each of the speakers will speak for 10 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have questions and answers and an open discussion. So, Irina, The floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Irina Isakian, and I would like to talk about American women in Italy and Greece and their example of ethnic entrepreneurship as an illumination of leadership of migrants. To begin with, a fundamental question that we probably should ask ourselves: what is leadership? There has been a lot of talks about it, but we haven't defined the leadership as such. And that's the major problem in social sciences, that leadership is a rather nebulous, ambivalent concept, like probably globalization, integration, because there are various definitions of leadership. Leadership, as understood by social scientists, can be equivalent to agency. What is it? An ability to utilize change in your life, to make use of change, to accept it positively, an ability to change your life. Or it can be external agency, external leadership, an ability to change the lives of others, an ability to mobilize community. And just imagine if we place this concept within the context of two other, no less ambivalent concepts, such as globalization and integration, the leadership of migrants becomes even more ambivalent, because de facto leadership should be associated with integration. Leaders, migrants, are those who are integrated, globalized, but what is it? And as a result, it's a rather ambivalent concept, leadership of migrants. It is understood on the one hand as a very quick solution in many studies as entry of migrants, for example, entry as independent migrants on work visas, student visas, entrepreneurial visas, versus dependent migrants like wives. Or it is reduced to the concept of community leadership, which is again is equalized with the concept of diasporic leadership. But what about women who migrate and are able to be leaders in mobilizing wider multicultural communities beyond the diasporic level? What about women who can be multifaceted leaders? And under what conditions can this multifaceted leadership be delivered? This is what we're going to think about today. In the majority of migration studies and integration studies, it is argued that one of the strategies to become leaders, to make a change, is migrant entrepreneurship. These are the questions. Just a very quick definition. By entrepreneurship, I mean a process of starting and running your own business, to be a small business owner. There is also an opinion that migrant entrepreneurship is usually related to niching or ethnic niche establishment. By niche, we mean overrepresentation of ethnic minorities in a specific occupational domain, which does not mean that, for example, women who worked as domestic workers in Italy or Greece are the only women who work in the domestic, the only women who work in the domestic sector. But for them, it's the maximum opportunity to show their potential. They may not even dominate the sector, but for them, it's one of the unique opportunities to show who they are and their skills related to their culture, nationality, like language learning, some educational capital, may be demanded within this context. Ethnic niching is not necessarily the same as entrepreneurship. However, the most successful examples of being a migrant entrepreneurs are those who are related to establishing your own niche, because it means that migrants are unique within the host society and hardly anyone can replace them. A lot has been said about migrant entrepreneurship of traditional migrants who migrate to Europe, for example, from China, Eastern Europe, and other developing countries. And we know actually not a lot about high-skilled migrants who migrate in the opposite direction, for example, from America to Southern Europe, because intrinsically they have rather high educational levels, so they should be able to make a change to become entrepreneurs. And now I would like to tell you a little bit more about the experiences of American women in Italy and Greece who migrated, as in majority of cases, as migrant wives following their Greek and Italian husband in the pursuit of love. Some of them did know in advance that they will have to requalify. Others did not. But what happens that they became entrepreneurs in the context of the recently expanding crisis, which is another paradox. The major forms of their ethnic entrepreneurship are teaching English to local people and giving practices of psychological counseling to local people. There is such an idea in literatures and policymaking as smart entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs, migrant entrepreneurs, should be smart. So they should catch the moment, they should be independent. I actually show that as smart entrepreneurs, these women are very resilient, because just imagine, they have managed to set up their enterprises in the time of the crisis where local people lose their jobs, commit suicide, go crazy. On the other hand, they are creative entrepreneurs, and creative entrepreneurship means using every moment, every opportunity to make your business flourish. They expanded. Their business is expanded, and the expansion is both qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative, for example, they do not just give private lessons, they quantitatively expand them into the project of the privately owned school, and because the crisis intensifies migration, they also engage Francophone teachers, Spanish, Hispanic teachers. Like one of my informants, she started with an English language school, then she hired a few people with a knowledge of French and a few people with a knowledge of Spanish, because many Italians now prepare for migration to Argentina, and also Greeks are trying to migrate to Quebec. The foreign language instruction is becoming more and more demanded in Greece and Italy, because affected by the crisis, they are in a huge demand of language resources to prepare for immigration. And who can actually give this instruction better than native speakers? So you see, it doesn't mean that in Italy and Greece there are no Italians or Greeks who can teach English, French, or Spanish. But because these people, they are native speakers of these languages, they know various cultural peculiarities, they can also give cross-cultural training that makes them kind of unique. Another example is psychological counseling. Like many of these women have clinical psychology degrees from universities. Again, it doesn't mean that in Greece or Italy there are no qualified native trained psychologists, but the psychological preparation in the States is much higher in quality, because no one will deny that the high rank of Harvard, University of Chicago, from which they graduate, is much higher than, for example, the University of Athens. Plus, a rich background, professional background in such activities as counseling, cross-cultural adoption, which are relatively new practices in Italy and Greece. And here are actually examples. Like one woman says that she started an English school where she hires French-speaking staff, Spanish-speaking staff. Another woman says, who is the owner of an English school, that she's not only teaching English in her school, having noticed that her students have behavioral problems, and having a psychology degree, she actually expanded the instructional services towards the counseling services. She provides counselors to students, their parents, on various aspects: civic culture, how to take care of stray dogs, of homeless people, how to be more tolerant, how to communicate between different generations. And actually that makes a huge therapeutic effect. Another aspect is that this leadership is not only the community leadership, it's the internalized leadership, because it makes a very huge impact on the personality of the women themselves. They do not only make change upon the community, they also have very positive economic changes, so they combine the pleasant aspect of migration with the useful aspect of migration. Although people in Greece and Italy are more and more impoverished and pay very small money for such services, there are many clients because of the crisis who need psychological counseling, foreign instruction. So altogether, the accumulation of money creates a rather good income for these women. So they say that the payment is very symbolic, but the clients, there are a lot of clients, therefore there is actually no shortage of payment. And they admit that, that their economic situation now is much better than it would have been if they were in the United States, because who needs the English language in the United States? And the psychological counseling does not actually create this community impact. Another thing is, what lessons can we learn from this experience, both scholars and policymakers? Well, the first lesson is that migrant leadership is multifaceted, it's multi-vector. And it will be too narrow-sided just to think about a particular example of migrant leadership. We should think about the package of aspects, a package of venues along which migrant leadership can develop. When we think about women migrants, we should also admit that these women can be community leaders, they can actually positively assess their own change. And that actually leads us to another question, that leadership is very contextual or dynamic. What supports leadership in one situation, like crisis, may not work in another situation and in another country. These women actually, some of them migrated in the 1980s, but they only started their practices when the crisis started to escalate. So they were not always leaders. So it's very contextual. And another very cynical lesson that we should learn is that there is a very intense interaction between immigration law and second economy, which is underestimated, because the hidden economy, the informal economy, has been extremely supportive of these women entrepreneurial activities, because this hidden economy, it supports the informal sector of service work in Italy and Greece. It also supports such activities as evading taxations, of having private clients without registering taxes. And also it gives them an opportunity not to bother about accreditation of their degrees. It's highly supportive. The second economy entices migrants. How does it entice migrants? The thing is that US women are usually weak cultural learners. For example, on the arena of marriage, they are not leaders. They cannot learn intercultural norms of cross-cultural marriage, but not in the second economy. Because if you, for example, I'm just finishing, look at the experience of former Soviet Union, where the gender contract was always based on the alternative economy, like women were marginalized, but they were seeking for alternative means, like queuing for goods, making arrangements to support their husbands. They knew it very well, but why don't they know how to do it in immigration? American women never did that, but how could they manage to learn this practice, which they never did before? How could they manage to incorporate it into their cultural capital? That's an interesting question, and I'm not a proponent of the second economy. I don't think it's a nice thing, but I think it's something that should not be neglected by policymakers, because immigration law will always remain restrictive, no matter how liberalized it is. Even if you look at the migration law of Canada, there are always restrictions, like naturalized citizens are privileged to apply. But the second economy is kind of much more robust if it is well established in the country. Yeah.
So from leadership through economy, leadership through evangelical churches.
Can you can, yes. Okay, thank you. So this is a great opportunity for me to present some preliminary data from an ongoing research. Oh, thanks, Orit. Just a sec. Okay. Let's start again. I need my timing. Okay, a great opportunity, I was saying, to present some preliminary data from a project that is still ongoing, that is titled Migrant Christianity and is funded by the European Commission. This project focuses on migrants, both men and women, from Latin America and Africa, Western Africa particularly, who are members of Protestant evangelical churches in Europe. But before I do this, before I present some of this data, let me give you some key information on the context of the research that is given by the spectacular growth of evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity worldwide. So we speak about the global evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity. You can look at these figures and you can see that there is a shifting in the center of gravity of Christianity from the global north to the global south. And in Europe too, including in Italy, mainline Protestant and Catholic churches are losing worshippers. They are affected by a demographic crisis, whereas migration-driven evangelical and especially Pentecostal churches that are Protestant churches are growing. And many of these Christian migrants in Italy come from Latin America. And if you look at the figures, most of the Latin American migrants in Italy are women. Most of these women belong to the urban middle classes in their home countries. They have relatively high levels of education, and most of them are employed as paid and care domestic workers. So there is an important dimension of de-skilling and class demotion, of downgrading social mobility, which is involved in international migration for these Latin American women. Now I will give you 3 stories of 3 Latin American migrant women who are members of an evangelical church in Italy. And I hope to show that these women use religion, evangelical religion, to negotiate gender inequality, class demotion, and to resist racism. The first story is Teresa's. Teresa left Ecuador to go to Italy after her family-run business went bankrupt. She had to provide financial support for her children and also for her parents. And in order to do that, she had to go to Italy. She had to leave her children with their grandparents. She knew that in Italy it was relatively easy to find a job as a caregiver for the elderly, but she was not prepared for the exploitative conditions that she experienced in her first job. She was undocumented. She was working as a live-in care worker. That means she lived in the house of her employer. So she had very long days, working days. She was very isolated also because she avoided public spaces as much as possible for fear of police controls. She talked to her family once a week over the phone. It was before the Skype and social network revolution, okay? Over time, Teresa started to attend church, and she came to see, over time, her job as a mission of evangelization, to help what she sees as the spiritually dead, the Italians. This is how many of my informants see the Europeans more broadly, as people who are in spiritual and moral danger because they live in a secularized society and they live, they think, in the ignorance of the Word of God. So Teresa, in her narrative, makes theological sense of her job and feels that in the workplace, she's not performing what is socially constructed as the dirty work, but she is filling the role of a contemporary apostle. And her Italian employer is no longer her employer. To some extent, the employer is someone who is in need of her spiritual help. The second story is Rocio. And this story of Rocio shows that evangelical migrant women can resist the downgrading social mobility that is involved in migration by transferring the skills that they have acquired in a way which is similar to what Irina said. They transfer the skills that they have acquired in their professional lives or in their studies before emigration to the religious sphere in the immigration context. And in so doing, in this process, they may become respected figures in the community, in the religious community. For example, Rocio studied in Ecuador to become a professional school teacher, but she never worked as a teacher in Ecuador because when she got married, her husband didn't want her to work. And in Italy, she works as a cleaner. In the church, over time, she has become a teacher in the Sunday school. She teaches the Bible to the children of the school. And finally, I tell you my last story. This is the story of Betty, who left Peru after she broke up with her husband. She's now a divorced woman. Her husband left her for another woman, claiming that she was responsible for their infertility. And attending the church in Italy was very important to her because this helped her to go through her divorce and to endure emotional distress. Yet at the same time, the church to which she belongs is an institution that celebrates traditional family values and motherhood. And initially this made her feel ashamed because she considered herself as a failure, as a wife and a mother. However, over time, Betty has taken up responsibility in the church for coordinating the training of those members of the church who wish to be baptized. And so in this respect, in doing so, she is responsible for bringing about their spiritual rebirth. And indeed, being born again is a key aspect of evangelical religion, being born again in the encounter with Christ. She told me proudly that now she's given a present on the celebration of Mother's Day that is organized by the church and that many members consider her as their spiritual mother. So Betty has come to feel a recognized and semi-public role in the church by extending the so-called feminine domestic roles to the semi-public religious sphere. Betty also uses her migrant status to claim that we need a more open and pragmatic approach to issues of sexual ethics and the family in the church to which she belongs. For example, in a religious meeting where the participants criticized other members of the church for living together without being married, which means, in the words of my informants, fornication, she said that it is necessary to interpret what the Bible says on sexual intercourse outside marriage while considering the specific situation of international migrants who, for example, cannot get married if they are undocumented in Italy. And in another meeting, she said that if there is no longer love between the husband and the wife, and if the two partners are physically separated because of international migration, well, it is legitimate to get a divorce. So this shows that women can take advantage of the migratory context to bend gender-wise conservative religious norms. I'll say something else as a conclusion. I will add that these examples of migrant women's agency and empowerment in this evangelical church point to the great ambivalence that exists between the tactical dimension of religion, and here I'm using a category by a British sociologist, Linda Woodhead. She uses the category of tactical religion to refer to the ways in which women can appropriate religion to carve out spaces of autonomy, self-fulfillment, leadership within churches. So I'm saying that there's an ambivalence between this tactical dimension of religion on the one hand, and on the other, there is resilient gendered asymmetry in the distribution of power in the church that I have studied. So in other words, what I'm saying is that we should not see these women as passive victims of conservative religious movements, but at the same time, we should not romanticize female leaderships in these churches. In fact, if we consider the overall gender division of work in the church that I have studied, so the distribution of tasks and roles in the church between men and women, how the different tasks, offices and roles are allocated to men and women, we see that this division of work remains traditional. Women are assigned to tasks that are seen as an extension of the women's domestic responsibilities, for example, teaching the children in the Sunday school. In religious meetings, it is men who explain the Bible to the group, to the rest of the attendants, while women facilitate the meetings and they pray. Because praying is seen, is represented as a form of care work at the service of the community for the welfare and the spiritual and material welfare of the rest of the community. So as a form of care work.
To internal immigrants in India and domestic workers.
Good evening, and it is a pleasure to be here with my colleagues. Thanks, Anna, for organizing this, and thanks, Orit, for coming all the way along in order to chair. And in my case, I'm going to move the focus on domestic workers, migrant domestic workers. I'm thanking also Irina and Francesca for already introducing the topic of domestic work and elderly care. But in the context of India. My presentation today is based not on a large research project, it's based on some pilot interviews that I've done in order to develop a project which I'm going to start. So I'm trying to put these things together under the label of leadership. What that might mean. If you think about the field of domestic work, paid domestic work, that's actually a field in which women, especially, have expressed a lot of agency, also in very conflictual ways, since a very long time. Scholars in the UK, for example, do argue that there are very important cases of poor domestic workers taking their employers to court, in front of the judge, already in the 17th century. So there is a history of leadership, of agency, of strong conflictual subjectivity of domestic workers, which goes very long back in time. Today, domestic workers are more or less 52 million people in the world, majority women, many of them are children, and therefore young girls. There are also some men. In the last few years, we have seen a strong moment of increase in women leadership in domestic work, if you want to use that word, thanks to the approval of the ILO Convention on the Rights of Domestic Workers. This was in 2011. The ILO, which is the International Labour Organization of the United Nations, has approved has formulated the minimum standards for the rights of domestic workers in the world. And what they say is the very basic, that might seem a banality for us, but it's actually very difficult achievement. They say that domestic workers are workers as all the others, and they have to have the same rights of all other workers. It's not, domestic work is not to be seen as something different, as something special, and therefore less valued than any other work. So, it is in this context that I want to show you this very important photo. A picture comes from the day in Geneva, in Switzerland, in which they approved the ILO Convention. The ILO Convention is the number 189 Convention, and these women that you see are some of the leaders. I'm trying to put this word into the debate, although usually I don't, maybe I use the word activists or representatives of groups from all around the world. So for several years, when it was, the convention was under debate, they crowdfunded money in order to pay travel tickets for these women to go there. So these are domestic workers themselves, and also their supporters. And very often domestic workers are migrants. Migration is all over the places when it comes to domestic work. As I already mentioned, in the Indian context, there are many internal migrants. But in Europe, as you may know, we have transnational migrants. Migrants coming from Eastern Europe very much in later time in Italy, but also transnational migrants are going in many different parts of the world to do domestic and care work, because this is considered to be a very important and major job opportunity for women because they are women. And so this was a very important day, and every year now on the 16th of June is the anniversary of that decision of the ILO in Geneva, and is the International Day for the Rights of Domestic Workers. As I was saying, this is also, has been an important field for the further development of agency by women activists for domestic workers' rights. These are different contexts. The big picture is from South Africa. The other one is from Mexico. The one above is also, I think, from the Caribbeans, and this other one is a gathering of women from different parts of the world, and I also put something on Indonesia. So what is a common thread in all these different contexts, in my view, is the fact that we always find that domestic workers do represent some of the most stigmatized people in that country. Therefore, we see that in countries in which black people are really stigmatized and at the lowest level of the social hierarchy, many black people will be in domestic work. In countries where migrants cover the same social position, we would have many migrants, and so forth. When it comes to the Indian context, this position is taken up by women from the very low caste. I'm not a specialist on India, so I don't dare to say too much on Indian society, but if we stick to the case of domestic workers, you will see that there are women from the low caste and also women that come from rural villages. That's why the internal migration comes into the picture. The fact that domestic workers are migrants gives a special shape to the question of the problems of domestic workers. We will have, for example, the problem of agencies, illegal agencies that organize the trip of these women to the big cities. So they come from very small villages in the rural area. They come from parts of India that Indians call tribal regions. So these type of women are called tribal girls. This is the common reference that is used to describe them. So agencies would organize their trip towards big cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, and there they would start to work informally in private homes. Informally is by default in that way, because in India you cannot have a contract as a domestic worker, so there are no formal rights. There are some rights that protect women, especially in the case of sexual abuse. You may know the infamous case of the young woman that was killed by sexual abuse, and therefore some measures have been put in place to protect also women working against sexual abuse, but there is not protection of domestic workers' rights as workers. So, but as you can see, there are some very important events of gathering for activists for domestic workers' rights, and they are mainly organized by a national platform that brings together different types of actors. They might be from Catholic background, they might be from women's groups, they might be from all kind of activist backgrounds. I'll go quickly to the point. So here you see that in the label that they have here, there is the region of India where they come from. This is a trade union for women only. It's a women-only trade union, which I think is interesting. These are different. My argument would be that you have women's leadership, women's strong agency at all different levels. So you have activists, but you also have officers and researchers. They tend to be women very often when it comes to domestic work. But what I'm more interested about is this type of women. For example, do you see that? So this woman and this woman. So these are women that used to be domestic workers themselves. And then they moved from the position of being the worker into the one of being the activist for the rights of the other workers. So this is in the context of a religious organization from a Jesuit missions, they allow one of the domestic workers for 2 years to be representative, to be an activist, and they pay her a salary for those 2 years. Then after 2 years, she goes back to the job, and another one will take the place. This is, instead, they are working against illegal agencies, the agencies I mentioned before. So the activities that these groups do are very different. In this case, for example, they do a lot of education and empowerment activities. They work against illiteracy. So, of course, I don't have the time to explain all the activities they do. But there is also a moment in which we see men coming into the picture, and this is especially on the question of trafficked women. So these girls that you see here are women that have been rescued by this man that you see. So person himself is the leader of an organization that is finding girls that have been trafficked against their will, and they work in abusive situation in Delhi. And the book is showing all the legal cases that he's following, and these are the girls. This is his iPad, as he's showing me on his iPad, the girls that are in the shelter where he put them. So to conclude, what do we see here? I mean, my reflection on that issue will be that there is no leadership of women if there has not been oppression and resistance. So what we see as leadership is the outcome of a process of building collective strategies for resistance, for resilience against oppression, and then this takes the form of maybe some few women that we can identify as leaders of the movement, but behind their shoulders there is, of course, a strong collective movement. As I said, domestic work is a very important field for enactment of this type of subjectivity because of, in gender terms, because domestic work as such is so gendered, and because so many women participate in that. If you look at leadership position in this field, it's rare that you have a man. So for example, in this type of context, you may have men, but when it comes to choosing the front person, they will choose a woman. And then, so I think that this is a good example of how we can look at leadership in gender terms, not only in a quantitative way, but also trying to look at the meaning of gender entering into the question of leadership. So not simply counting the number of women, but what gender does at what leadership is or might be.
Thank you very much. And now we move from internal Indian migrants to hearing about undocumented maternity and healthcare again in Europe.
Thank you very much. So, as we've already heard from several papers in this session, leadership, especially in the context of women migrants' lived experiences, may be difficult to define or may carry very different meanings according to the context in which it is used. Among the questions we're asked to address here, is there indeed leadership among migrant women? And if so, what does it look like? My field, which is anthropology, has a long history of critical engagement with key concepts used in international development and advocacy, such as leadership and empowerment. Most critics argue that these are concepts based on Western notions of individualism and personal achievement, and on ideas of improvement and betterment, which may not be well understood or fit in many parts of the world. Some recent writings have even suggested that today, more than ever, female empowerment wings of large international development initiatives have difficulty listening to local women and involving them in decision-making processes on their own terms. This also appears to be true in the case of female empowerment initiatives championed by global maternal health programs aimed at curbing maternal and neonatal mortality and morbidity rates in the run-up to the 2015 Millennium Development Goals. Top-down international initiatives which focus on educating individual female patients and healthcare workers tend to have limited success rates. But in contrast, astonishing results were obtained in reproductive health programs which demonstrated a real commitment to listen to the local populations and use existing social knowledge support networks coupled with integrated family subsidies to improve general standards of living. When individual leaders are privileged interlocutors with authorities, these programs tend to be less successful. When a more inclusive process is devised that goes beyond the more charismatic and outspoken individuals to consult communities more widely, then the results tend to be far better. A leader, in other words, cannot exceed the quality of her relations with the rest of her community. But in the front line of migrants' health, community is a vexed concept. At best, fragments of shifting communities can be found, posing a real challenge to any incipient representative leadership. However, the main problems for someone working on migration and global health governance, and maternal health in particular, are the specific structural and cultural frameworks which pervade the way hospitals work and maternity care is delivered. Hospitals are usually hierarchical institutions where top-down decision-making is the norm and where doctors are assumed to know best. Maternal health, more than any other medical field, is also laden with morality. A good part of antenatal care is based on risk prevention of what is otherwise a healthy physiological process. It rests on ensuring good behavior on the part of the expecting mother, and how you define good behavior fluctuates across time and space and can be distorted by prejudice on the part of health workers. One might imagine that individual charismatic leadership among patients might be able to spearhead change in the system. However, the moral expectations of care relationships and the structural features of doctor-patient relations are deeply ingrained. As an anthropologist working on medicine and ethics, I'm interested in how moral values and conventions shape biomedicine and how Western medicine is delivered, administered, and managed, especially in cross-cultural contexts, where questions of morality, deservingness, and universalism often become exacerbated. I could offer examples of heroic acts on the part of practitioners or of bravery and resilience on the part of migrants, but to do this would undermine the fact, which I think is of greater importance, that it is through cooperation and empathy that even greater things are accomplished. As many feminist scholars have argued, feminine politics places greater emphasis on cooperation and empathy rather than individual charisma. This might mean shifting emphasis from leadership to cooperation. My ERC-funded project, named EU Border Care, is a comparative 5-year study of maternity care services delivered to undocumented pregnant migrants on Europe's external peripheries. Since 2011 in particular, the proportion of pregnant migrants crossing Europe's external borders in often harrowing physical and mental conditions is on a steady rise. However, despite sporadic media coverage, very little is known on the subject, especially in this part of the world, so in Europe. The data me and my team members collect is qualitative and is based on long-term fieldwork. Starting this summer, we will spend up to 14 months living in densely crossed borderlands, interviewing, shadowing, and socializing with local residents, local doctors and relief staff, and pregnant migrants and their relatives. We focus on maternity care, so we do work within hospital wards, but because of steadily increasing proportion of undocumented pregnant women are receiving antenatal and perinatal care in exceptional circumstances, we'll also be working out of bounds on board naval vessels, in refugee camps, or in other informal, impromptu settings. So as in this case, undocumented patients may be women who are fleeing conflict and persecution and who've just crossed into the EU and do not yet possess entitlements to social security and welfare. However, undocumented patients can also be indigenous and tribal women who live in a remote international border area, such as in the Guianas in South America, or local Comorians and their relatives who live in Mayotte in the Indian Ocean. These patients, despite being native to the place, often are undocumented or have incomplete bureaucratic existence in the eyes of the nation state. So these two French overseas departments, which are integral parts of the European Union, are fascinating because it is where we find the largest and fastest growing maternity wards in the whole of Europe. So despite rigid bureaucratic hospital cultures in all of the sites we'll be conducting fieldwork in, the countries we work in categorize childbirth as urgent care under specific protective clauses which are rooted in national pro-family policies. This means that perinatal care and some antenatal and postnatal treatments are provided for free, regardless of legal status and personal circumstances. So pregnant women in European borderlands are thus protected by law as vulnerable subjects, and by law must not be detained, prosecuted, or made to give birth under custody. But this temporary legal sanctuary status has become a burning politicized issue, because politically motivated actors often speculate upon the women's underlying motivations in often heavily moralizing language, questioning, for instance, what kind of mothers these women must be if they're ready to subject their unborn child to such risks. At this preliminary stage of our project, the data we have so far further challenges the place of leadership in these women's life trajectories. We've yet to find any examples of women in this category who've emerged as political leaders, and the idea of leadership may not be an appropriate focus, since it is cooperation and empathy, together with a due application of existing humanitarian regimes, that has allowed these women to give birth in host countries. My suggestion, as a conclusion for a more inclusive and appropriate framework, would be to talk instead of dignity. Pregnant crossings often participate in a wider search for dignity, one which acknowledges individual agency, but also inclusiveness and multiplicities of views and values in the migration project. Singling individual cases out and branding them as leaders risks placing undue emphasis on individual circumstances and motivations, and also, well, importantly, turning away from collective responsibilities and duties. In fact, the existing legal and institutional protection for these women is the result of years of effort by a range of different actors, and there is no single heroic narrative to tell. The same is true for the stories of these women's lives, who are as much victims of circumstances as they're brave and resilient individuals who've chosen to risk their lives to seek a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Our last speaker will now, Daniela Ayutu, will bring us a perspective from a non-research, non-scholarly, but a political and leadership position in Europe.
Thank you. Io parlerò in italiano, quindi anzi approfitto per ringraziare le traduttrici che mi stanno dando una mano. Innanzitutto grazie per l'invito, sono stata veramente onorata di partecipare a questo panel, veramente soprattutto l'ultimo intervento. All'interno del tuo intervento, ti do del tu, ci sono molti degli elementi che con i quali noi ci approcciamo nella Commissione FAM al Parlamento Europeo. Ecco, volevo iniziare questo intervento citando le parole di un rapporto dell'Agenzia delle Nazioni Unite che si occupa dei movimenti delle popolazioni e quindi di migrazione, ossia che la migrazione femminile è un fiume possente ma silenzioso, una rivoluzione in espansione di movimento e di empowerment, ma che resta in gran parte silenzioso. Questo perché? Perché se la migrazione internazionale per lungo tempo ha ottenuto poca attenzione, quella femminile ne ha ottenuta ancora meno. Non so se mi devo fermare. Ecco.
Yes, well, I'll be speaking Italian, and could I avail of this opportunity to thank the interpreters for their contributions. So thank you very much for this invitation, and it is indeed a great honour to be here on this panel, and I was particularly interested in the last speaker in that many of the elements she mentioned are indeed factors which are studied by the FAM Committee of the European Parliament, the Committee for Women's Affairs. And I'd like to start off with a quote from a UN agency, which more or less goes as follows. Migration is like a quiet river. It's a river which gradually and silently expands and leads to empowerment. And I think that this is particularly relevant when one thinks of the fact that international immigration as a topic was very much out of the limelight. Well, you can imagine how much female immigration was dealt with. In fact, it was virtually neglected.
Le donne rappresentano circa la metà dei flussi migratori internazionali. L'esistenza di migrazioni in cui l'elemento dominante è costituito da donne rappresenta un importante fattore di novità. A tal proposito si è cominciato a parlare di femminizzazione dei flussi migratori. Diversamente dal passato, infatti, oggi le donne intraprendono da sole il viaggio verso il paese di destinazione. Vi do qualche dato. La componente femminile costituisce il 48% dei flussi migratori internazionali, mentre le donne che hanno superato gli uomini come numero rappresentano il 51,6% dei migranti nelle regioni sviluppate e il 43% dei migranti nelle regioni in via di sviluppo. Ecco, per molto tempo le migranti sono state associate al fenomeno del ricongiungimento familiare durante gli anni della crescita del flusso migratorio nei paesi europei. Le donne si univano alla migrazione maschile poco qualificata dopo qualche anno dell'arrivo dei primi migranti, spesso in condizioni molto difficoltose e con un accesso limitato ai diritti, in considerazione del fatto che insomma, non conoscessero la lingua parlata nei paesi d'accoglienza e alla loro scolarizzazione che era o limitata o totalmente assente.
Women represent roughly half of international migratory flows, and the figures on the increase, which is indeed quite a new element. In fact, nowadays people are talking about feminization of international migratory flows. And these women are women who are starting this long journey on their own. To give you an idea of the current situation, one could say the following: 48% of international migratory flows involve women, and 51.6% of migrants are women in developed regions, whereas 43% are men in developing regions. Before, the trend was that women used to travel simply to join their husband or their partner who had emigrated before them, and they arrived in a very difficult situation in which their skills were limited, their rights were limited as well, their language skills were poor, and very often they had very little schooling, if any.
Successivamente è iniziato invece il periodo dei rifugiati, quello che stiamo vivendo anche in questi giorni, durante il quale si sono configurate varie categorie di donne migranti. Da una parte abbiamo coloro che hanno preso parte alla riunificazione familiare dopo l'ottenimento dello status di rifugiato da parte del congiunto, poi ci sono quelle che appartenevano alla categoria degli sfollati interni nei paesi di crisi, e infine ci sono le migranti che sono arrivate da sole per sfuggire a regimi o società che le discriminavano in quanto donne. I primi studi sulla migrazione femminile che si sono sviluppati già nel XX secolo negli Stati Uniti hanno fornito un'immagine di donna migrante come passiva, arretrata, subalterna, dipendente e totalmente sottomessa. Invece in Europa i primi studi sulla migrazione femminile cominciano ad apparire intorno agli anni 70 a seguito delle mutate politiche migratorie che interessano appunto l'Europa. Appare sulla scena socioculturale qualche interesse per la donna migrante. La donna immigrata comincia a essere vista in un'ottica differente, quindi da vittima passiva diventa attore sociale e ricopre ruoli e funzioni importanti.
Then we had a new type of a scenario in which we had refugees, women who are refugees similar to the situation at the moment. And one could in a way split them into different categories. First of all, you have a woman who would join her husband who would have been given refugee status in the country he emigrated to and who would therefore join him. Then there's a second category of people who are displaced persons and identified as such in the country of origin or in another country. And then the third category are women who are migrants who have arrived in a new country because they have been subject to discrimination. The initial studies, American studies which were carried out, depict these migrant women as being very subdued and submitted to their husband and people who tend to adopt a very modest stance in society, whereas European studies, which were carried out later in the 70s, would indicate that due to changes in migratory flows, there is a greater interest which is given to the figure of the woman migrant. They are seen from a slightly different angle, and no longer as passive individuals, indeed more active and capable of occupying important social positions and playing important social roles.
Chiaramente nell'affrontare i problemi delle migrazioni dal punto di vista del genere ho avuto modo di affrontare in Commissione FEM tutti questi aspetti che vi ho descritto. Nel corso dei processi migratori infatti emergono in modo evidente l'esclusione e la marginalizzazione che vivono le donne solo per il fatto di essere donne. La loro forte presenza nel lavoro domestico e di cura, abbiamo visto anche gli interventi precedenti, e la loro capacità di risparmio e di invio di rimesse nei loro paesi d'origine. In particolare, se volgiamo lo sguardo verso i paesi di origine degli immigrati e le risorse e i fondi trasferiti tra soggetti privati, questi stanno aumentando, stanno assumendo dei volumi e delle dimensioni che convincono sempre più sul ruolo che le migrazioni stesse possono avere per quanto riguarda lo sviluppo dei paesi d'origine. Le rimesse dei migranti a livello mondiale ammontano a circa 230 miliardi di dollari, quindi le rimesse inviate alle proprie famiglie dalle immigrate, stiamo parlando di un centinaio di migliaia di dollari, quindi le donne mandano a casa una parte maggiore in proporzione rispetto agli uomini dei loro guadagni e in modo regolare e costante. Inoltre, sempre una ricerca dell'agenzia dell'ONU che vi dicevo prima, rivela che il 56% delle rimesse femminili viene usata per le necessità quotidiane, l'assistenza sanitaria o l'istruzione.
In the Committee for Women's Affairs of the European Parliament, I've had occasion to study all of the aspects which have been mentioned today, and we have come to the conclusion that exclusion and marginalization do exist and are suffered by these women simply because of the fact that they are women. And the whole issue of domestic workers, which has been discussed today, and remittances have also been studied. It is clear that in the country of origin of these women, the exchange of resources and money between private individuals has increased exponentially. And this is clearly due to the role of these migrant women, migrants in general, who contribute to the development of their country. In fact, the figure mentioned is $230 billion which have been sent to the countries of origin. So women, according to the statistics, send back more money than their male counterparts, and they do so on a regular and a constant basis. 56% of the remittances are used for daily necessities, for healthcare and educational purposes.
Le caratteristiche proprie dell'identità di genere femminile, la condizione subalterna della donna, la mansione lavorativa svolta frequentemente ai margini e la poca conoscenza della lingua del paese ospitante sono i principali presupposti della cosiddetta doppia esclusione, di cui le donne migranti sono spesso vittime. Doppia esclusione significa che le donne intanto vengono discriminate proprio perché donne, quindi vengono relegate a svolgere dei lavori considerati tipicamente femminili e proprio perché tipicamente femminili meno remunerati. E in secondo luogo vengono discriminate proprio perché straniere, quindi sono considerate insomma l'altro. È un qualcosa che emerge sempre più in tutti i settori della società, nelle varie fasi della vita. E nei lavori parlamentari ci siamo ritrovati spesso ad affrontare questo tipo di problema. Oggi sempre più i paesi d'accoglienza vedono il consolidamento della posizione delle donne migranti all'interno delle aree urbane in crisi, come mediatrici per istituzioni pubbliche e popolazione, come militanti che fanno da portavoce per i drammi privati.
Because of the characteristics of the female gender, because of this subordinate role they are supposed to take on, because of their marginalization, because of the lack of their language skills, women are very often excluded twice over, as it were. They are discriminated against, first of all, because they are women, and therefore given tasks which are considered to be typically female and therefore less well paid. And they are also discriminated against because they are foreigners. And this is very much apparent in society in general, in all sorts of different sectors and during the course of different phases of life. And these are matters which we've often dealt with in the European Parliament. And this leads me on to the role of women in environment, in different environments, such as urban environments, where they can indeed become more militant and speak out for their rights.
Chiaramente queste tematiche sono quasi costantemente al centro dei dossier di cui ci occupiamo a Bruxelles e in particolare abbiamo ultimamente il cosiddetto report Honeyball che prende il nome proprio dalla relatrice, in cui il lavoro si è incentrato proprio sulla situazione delle donne rifugiate e richiedenti asilo all'interno dell'Unione Europea. Quindi ho seguito questo report in prima persona e abbiamo voluto evidenziare all'interno di questa relazione una serie di problematiche a partire dalle cause primarie che stanno alla base dello sfruttamento delle donne nei paesi terzi, fino ad arrivare alle misure di prevenzione, di assistenza e di lotta. Infatti molto spesso ci troviamo a curare gli effetti della migrazione femminile senza pensare alle cause che vi sono a monte e che spesso portano le donne a dover abbandonare i propri paesi di origine, vuoi perché discriminati dalle leggi vigenti, vuoi perché considerate inferiori per retaggi culturali o sociali, religiosi, oppure perché chiaramente arrivano a una vera e propria tratta di esseri umani in alcuni casi.
In Parliament, we've discussed these matters on a number of occasions, and recently we've been dealing with the Honeyball report, named after the rapporteur. This deals with the situation of women who are refugees and who are asylum seekers. We've dealt with these issues, as I was saying. Very often we end up concentrating on the current situation, and we sometimes simply don't get around to dealing with the actual causes. We deal more with the effects as opposed to the actual roots of these problems. These are very often women who've been obliged to leave their countries because of the law enforcement in the country, because they're considered to be inferior for religious reasons, or because they are the victims of trafficking in some cases.
Abbiamo posto l'accento, sempre all'interno di questo report, sulle esigenze delle donne nelle procedure di asilo, in quanto riteniamo che le donne richiedenti asilo dovrebbero avere accesso quanto prima a un'assistenza legale e morale che le metta nelle condizioni di superare il trauma psicologico, la vergogna e la stigmatizzazione di cui sono vittime a seguito, per esempio, delle violenze subite. Abbiamo quindi chiesto il diritto di avvalersi di una persona incaricata a condurre il colloquio e un interprete dello stesso sesso in modo da poter avere un'adeguata assistenza sia per sé sia ad esempio per la prole nel momento in cui c'è il colloquio con magari l'interprete per spiegare le ragioni insomma, della propria migrazione, del proprio viaggio, ci deve essere anche del personale che si occupa dei bambini. Ci siamo inoltre preoccupati di affrontare il tema dell'inclusione sociale e dell'integrazione, delle condizioni di accoglienza e di trattenimento, per dare importanza a tutte le questioni rilevanti dal punto di vista del genere nel processo di migrazione e di richiesta asilo.
We also dealt with the requirements which we believe should be met to help women arriving, women who are refugees and who are asylum seekers. They should be granted the appropriate legal assistance, and they also often need psychological help to overcome the traumas which they've been through. We believe that these women therefore need to be in the company of experts who can help them, along with possibly an interpreter of the same gender and staff to look after the children when these discussions are taking place. We've also been trying to enhance the inclusion and integration of these women by ensuring that the appropriate help is provided to them when they arrive.
Non dobbiamo, come dicevo prima, dimenticare le cause che sono a monte dei processi migratori. Quante donne vengono sfruttate solo perché provengono da un modello di società che le considera non degne di avere pari diritti rispetto agli uomini? Quante donne subiscono violenze che sfociano spesso anche in femminicidi per via di leggi ingiuste in determinati stati che violano i diritti umani fondamentali? Penso a una pratica terribile come quella della lapidazione, che è ancora oggi purtroppo molto diffusa in alcuni paesi, con cui, questi stessi paesi, intratteniamo rapporti di natura commerciale e con cui facciamo affari per interessi meramente economici. Questo problema l'ho portato all'attenzione del direttore della Banca Centrale della Banca Mondiale a New York durante la scorsa sessione della 60ª Commissione sullo Stato delle Donne presso le Nazioni Unite. Ecco, in tale occasione insomma, ho chiesto al direttore Claros, ho rivolto un duro messaggio a interrompere questa indegna pratica di finanziamento di affari laddove non si ha il benché minimo rispetto dei più fondamentali diritti, sia diritti umani, sia in particolare diritti per le donne. Grazie.
But of course, we mustn't forget to look into the real roots behind these migratory flows. These women are being exploited very often in their countries of origin. They are not entitled to enjoy normal human rights. They are the victims very often of situations in which women are killed simply because of the practices in their countries. There are countries which still practice lapidation, for instance, countries which indeed enjoy special trade relations and with European countries, and where economic advantage and profit seems to prevail. This is something which I brought up with the director of the World Bank in New York on the occasion of the 60th UN Commission on the Status of Women, which took place recently, and I asked the director, Claros, to stop this dreadful practice of continuing with these economic relations despite the fact that human rights and women's rights are being flouted by these countries.
So I dare say that having listened to our panelists, we are probably the most educated group on the planet in this particular topic of leadership of migrant women, perhaps because nobody else has ever given it any thought whatsoever. So I mentioned the global stat data before. This is the little booklet that everybody can get that was created especially for our conference here. And if I look through it, I see talk of leadership of women in courts, in parliaments, in upper echelons of society. And our aim was to try and conceptualize from the very beginning what it might possibly mean and whether it even makes sense to speak of leadership among migrant women, among that strata of the population that is least advantaged. And you're of course invited to ask the panelists questions, but you're also invited to join in the conversation and express your own views on whether you think leadership is appropriate. And having heard the different cases of such perhaps leadership, whether you can see any common denominator that you would like to conceptualize. Who knows, you might be writing the articles that come out of here. This is going to be a whole new area of academic research, and we will have started it right here today, and 20 years from now, they will celebrate us. So I'm stalling to give you time to think, and anybody interested in asking questions or expressing views? I have one volunteer. Anyone else? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so let's take 3 at a time, and maybe the rest of you will feel more empowered. And please introduce yourself as you speak.
Good evening. I'm Isabella Mancini. I'm a member of an association, Intercultural Association of Women, Migrant and Native. And our experience is really similar to that one that Mrs. Marchetti talked about what's happening in India. And usually our president, she comes from Somalia, she used to say that our association is an association of ex-prostitutes and ex-social worker. And so from this point of view, I would like to ask you, why did you choose domestic work? Why did you choose domestic work as lens through which we had to see the point of the topic of women as leader in migration? Because in the precedent panel, we talk about leadership, women leadership, talking about leader of words, talking about political. So why did you choose this point of view to see and talk about this issue, this topic?
Thank you. Aitana?
There's two. Excellent. Aitana Guia, Max Weber Fellow here at the EUI. I have a couple of very short questions. The first one is about whether all speakers could discuss a little bit more the connection between leadership and power. And it came to me, especially when Sabrina was talking about leadership in terms of resistance and leadership in terms of collective action. And I was thinking that if I were thinking of male leadership, I wouldn't be thinking necessarily on those terms of resistance and collective action. I would be thinking maybe more of even individual power. So I would like to discuss a little bit more the issue of power and leadership. And the second question is, when you were talking about women as leaders in the migration process, I was thinking about migrant women as leaders in other areas as well, not just in the migration process. And I'm in particular thinking of three women. There's a woman called Rita Bosajo, who was born in Equatorial Guinea and has become the first MP in Spain that is Afro-Spanish. She's a migrant herself. She's a pioneer migrant, the first generation. She came to Spain when she was in her early 20s. She's a migrant woman, but nevertheless, she's making a leadership position beyond what we would expect to be the migration process. The other two are Fatima Taleb, who became, or Huma Jamshed. One is from Morocco, the other one's from Pakistan, and both of them are elected as city councillors in Badalona and Barcelona as part of the new social movements that are emerging in Spain. Barcelona en Comú, the equivalent of Podemos for the region of Catalonia. So my question is whether we can talk about migrant leaders beyond the migration process. Thank you.
Anna?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I think it's a general question, but perhaps particularly addressed to three out of the four, more to Vanessa, Francesca, and Irina. What is the importance of class and family background? What is the in you know, the very different cases that you've highlighted? Like, it makes me think. I mean, I think it's more obvious in these mostly highly skilled U.S. citizens or Australians, Anglophone migrant women in Southern Europe, but I was wondering also for, you know, undocumented mothers. Oftentimes international migrants really come for middle-class backgrounds, even if they find themselves in very difficult situations, living under very difficult conditions, but also these very interesting cases of leadership that you highlighted, Francesca.
So we're not going to have a chance for a second round of questions, so may I encourage you to ask or comment now, and then we'll have the panelists reply to everyone. Last chance, anyone? Okay, then we'll start by the same order, because it's been a long time since Irina got a chance.
Well, perhaps my answer to the question of Anna, the importance of class and family background. Well, in terms of class, I have interviewed women who are well educated. They are all already affiliated de facto before immigration to middle class, upper middle class, or elite. So if I look only at the experiences of these women, yes, it seems like the class is very much relevant, because what makes them a niche-oriented entrepreneur category is that they have specific capital, like psychological training. They are not charlatans. They are not just informal amateurs in psychology, having read internet sources. They are qualified psychologists who may not have confirmed degrees in Greece or Italy, but they have degrees from Harvard, from UCLA, UChicago. And if we compare them with traditional migrants from low class who work as vendors or in trade from less developed countries. Scholarship actually stresses that the experiences of these migrants, the entrepreneurship experiences, does not sustain the impact of crisis. It does not go counter-crisis. It is surrounded by the crisis just because they don't have such unique skills for which there will be always a demand. So the class impact is evident in this particular research. As far as the family ground is concerned, it's a very interesting situation. On the one hand, these women actually say that they don't need very rich clients because on the one hand, they can charge very small pocket money from each client because they have many clients. On the other hand, they have some savings from their prior lives. They may be at the early retirement stage, or they may be from well-to-do families. They have some backup opportunity. They have some return platform. So actually they can afford being generous. They can afford being community leaders. And that's actually immediate family supports them. As far as their husbands' families are concerned, before the crisis, their husbands were not very much supportive and in-laws of their entrepreneurial skills because in the best scenario, those women were working as dependents in family, Greek or Italian enterprises, supporting the bakery, chicken plant activities of their husbands. But the crisis actually impacted negatively on their husbands' enterprises. Their husbands are economically devastated. In the majority of cases, their husbands actually saw this niche and they started to invest into their wives' business, preparing together for immigration or participating in their wives' ethnic economies. So as far as their husbands are concerned, here we see another direction of impact. The crisis has impacted on entrepreneurship, and women's leadership has impacted on their immediate family leadership. So, and this probably actually returns us to the question of Aitana, who said that the man is a leader uncontextually. He is a leader in the family, he's a leader in business. For women, it's more contextual. They were not leaders in the family integration before because they were dependent on their husbands and they were telling stories of deprivation, of despair, like losing oneself within the families on these mothers-in-law, sisters-in-law. But the crisis actually intensified their individual leadership position within their families because their husbands' families are now dependent on their income.
And also, Aitana, they have become leaders to the communities into which they have moved. So it's not just about they teach English and so forth. Sabrina.
Yeah, thank you to the three of you for these very interesting questions. As I specified in the beginning, leadership is not usually my topic of research, but I've been asked to think through this notion and see how that could relate to what is my research topic, that is domestic work, paid domestic workers and migrant domestic workers struggles, and domestic workers struggles, migrants and non-migrants. And so it is important here also to answer to the first question, if I got it right, because I got distracted. So why domestic work? No? Why paid domestic work? Here it is important to see that I'm not talking about the job as such, but I'm talking about the type of activism and organization for claiming rights. So in my field of analysis in the moment is the organizing, what is called domestic workers organizing usually. And in these strategies, what I see, I mean, the way when in my conclusion I said, let us see what gender does to leadership. And then I'm touching on Aitana's question. I will not be in favor of going and look how women leaders are different than men leaders on these sort of, if I may say, essentialist terms, like how to be a woman leader is to like different from being a man leader. So like, for example, men are more individualistic, women are more collective. That was not my type of suggestion. My suggestion was like, what is happening when a woman leader is doing her political struggle, her labor rights struggle, on a matter as domestic work which is so gendered. Because in the moment in which you change domestic work as such, like exploitation in domestic work, you are changing the condition of mainly women. So you're not, on many fields we can say they touch on women, like even if you do, for example, activism on environmental rights, that will touch on women's life, but on the question of domestic work, this is so relevant to women's life in so many countries. So it's more like the matter of the organizing or the activism than the fact they are women themselves. We also have the fact that they are mostly women. As I said, usually the front people, the spokesperson are women. But I would not say that, and also the question of leadership, I said I don't really use it, I should close, but it is a term which is very much used, especially in English-speaking migrant communities. They use this term, she's my leader, she's our leader very much. So that's also, I think, a matter of reflection.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. So we have 5 more minutes, which is a minute and a half for each of you. Francesca.
Thank you. Okay, very briefly, Anna Triantafylidis' question first.
Turn it on.
Yeah. Okay. The first question from Anna Triantafylidis. Okay, what's the relationship between class and family background and religious participation? One of the answers is, okay, as I said, these women experience class demotion and downgrading social mobility within the context of international migration. Religious participation, in a way, we could say, compensates for this class demotion because they achieve social recognition within the semi-public sphere of the church, and also through this transfer of skills from one social sphere to another. And with regard to family background, I think that here religious participation and the identification with positive, respectable models of Christian femininity can enable these women to counter, to resist gendered racialization that in Italy makes Latin American women hyper-visible as, Latin American women are stigmatized as bad mothers because, they are stigmatized, I'm just trying to be very quick, as bad mothers and the head of broken families who are actually transnational families that are represented in public debates and in the media quite often as pathological families. And just to reply briefly to Aitana Guia's question on leadership, well, I've been thinking, should I include the first example on Teresa? You remember Teresa, the domestic worker who comes to see her job as a mission of evangelization. I thought, yes, I mean, it's a different form of leadership. Certainly, she doesn't come to alter, to modify the structural relations in which her insertion into domestic service is inscribed based on structural inequalities associated with gender and class divisions and with ethnicity. But in a way, I think conceiving her job as such helped her to be a happier domestic worker. Does this legitimate and reproduces exploitation? I think to some extent this could make her happier, and to some extent she could, in her subjective view, subverts the roles and paternalistic representation of domestic service that are dominant, so that the domestic worker is someone who is in need of help from the employer, okay? At the same time, I'd like to say that Christianity, for these workers can provide a discursive resource, a language that they can use to challenge abusive employers who do not comply, do not respect universal Christian values of solidarity and so on. And finally, I just quote one of my informants who said, okay, I think that I am a Christian domestic worker, and I think I do this job also as a Christian job, that I help the elderly because I'm a Christian, but at the same time, she said, being a Christian does not mean being dupe. And she said, I am a worker, I know my rights, and I want to have them respected.
Thank you. Vanessa.
Yeah, so very quickly, I think I'll focus on Anna's question, on class and background. So as I've presented, I work in borderlands. Often the people I work with, so especially the migrant women, are at the end of what is usually a long journey, a long process of migration, where they may have changed circumstances and maybe got pregnant on the way as a result of sexual violence in particular. In this context of in the Mediterranean in particular, of the crisis as it is, especially in this humanitarian relief sort of efforts that we're witnessing, class and background sort of melt away in a sense, because in the face of what has happened for the women to the conditions in which the sort of physical, social, and emotional conditions in which they actually cross the borders. By then, it is extremely difficult to actually see distinctions being enacted, or for them to be able to demand a certain way of being treated by relief operations, or people working in relief operations. And of course, I think what we were saying this morning as well in your panel on looking at whether the migration crisis was going to make or break Europe, I think the fact that, as you were saying, the distinctions between economic and refugee can very much become blurred. And for example, I can think of many stories of women who are originally, for example, West African women working in Libya as domestic care workers, who was then, in a sense, motivated partly by economic reasons, motivations, who then got stuck in a country in conflict and had to flee for security reasons. So more than ever on European borderlands today, what we see is a merging of a lot of different motivations, backgrounds. There's no clear story to tell, and people always have very complicated persona, and everything sort of becomes blurred. And that's what I was trying to explain, that in this context, showing agency in a humanitarian context is quite difficult on the part of the patients.
Vanessa, we really have to finish.
So that's it.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Daniela, would you like to say the last word?
Ma io, per quanto riguarda il concetto di leader, non ho affrontato questo concetto nella mia esposizione, ma non è escluso, nel senso che, così come è riportato, il processo migratorio fa arrivare le donne in Europa. Per quanto riguarda l'Europa, sta all'Europa dare a queste donne la possibilità di emanciparsi, così come è data la possibilità di emanciparsi a tutte le donne europee, deve essere data anche a chi raggiunge l'Europa per svariati motivi che abbiamo visto. Quindi in questo deve intervenire la politica, non soltanto con azioni concrete, ma anche cercando di realizzare quelle misure di integrazione con la popolazione che vanno proprio anche nel cercare di dialogare il più possibile con i cittadini e cercare di far aprire i cittadini all'accoglienza di queste donne migranti, perché è l'unico modo per poter garantire opportunità a tutte le donne, senza più la distinzione di provenienza migrante o cittadina nativa europea. E da lì poi scaturiscono le possibilità per tutte le donne. Noi lavoriamo proprio su questo in Commissione FEM, cerchiamo di aiutare l'emancipazione femminile. Mi viene in mente l'ultimo report attraverso per esempio la digitalizzazione, le nuove tecnologie, è uno dei settori che può garantire l'emancipazione delle donne e perché no anche delle donne migranti.
Could you just give us a summary? I'm sorry, we should have ended a few minutes ago.
Yes, why didn't I mention the concept of leader? I didn't actually mention it specifically in my presentation, but I didn't exclude it either. Migratory flows are bringing more and more women to Europe. It's up to Europe to ensure that they're able to emancipate. Emancipation has to be provided for women across the board. Politicians should ensure that not only are concrete actions implemented, but they should also try to facilitate the integration process with the population. There should be a dialogue with citizens. This is the only way to open up to to the phenomenon of migrant women. And the only way forward is to ensure that there are opportunities provided to all women, be they migrants or natives in Europe. This is what has been discussed and studied at the Committee for Women's Affairs in the European Parliament. In fact, the last report we dealt with digital literacy and digitization, new technologies. That is definitely a key sector where women should be able to ensure that their rights prevail.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you everyone for your curiosity and endurance.
I'm sorry, what? We're just looking for the fourth member of our panel who has been seen wandering around the premises, and we hope to recuperate her very soon. So thank you for your patience. Hello. Thank you for coming, and welcome to our panel on sexual and reproductive politics. We have an action-packed afternoon prepared for you, so hang on to your seats. Our first speaker will be Marianne Case, who is the Arnold Schur Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School, but also a Brodell Fellow here at the EUI. And her recent publications include two articles that are very relevant to today's panel. The first is called After Gender, the Destruction of Man, the Vatican's Nightmare Vision of the Gender Agenda for Law, which came out in the Pace Law Review in 2012, and Perfectionism and Fundamentalism in the Application of the German Abortion Laws, which came out in a law review whose title I don't entirely understand, in 2015.
International University, and it's 2016.
Oh.
Last week.
Oh, okay, which came out last week in something called Law Review International University?
Law Review International University.
Okay. So, without further ado, I'm going to let Marianne speak, and then I'll introduce each of our speakers as they come up into play. So, each of you, you have more because we've lost the map. So, let's say 10. Okay. Take 10 minutes. Go.
Delighted also to be a fellow at EUI, which allows me to continue my research into the Vatican's anathemization of the English word gender. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but the Vatican has, since at least the Beijing Conference in 1995 on women, and arguably since the Rio Conference on the environment, the Cairo Conference on population, been very nervous about the use of the English word gender in documents about law written in English. And it has cathected under the word gender everything I'm for, and I hope a lot of you are for, and the Vatican is against. To wit, feminism, including the kind of radical feminism the Vatican has investigated the American religious women for, new forms of family formation, LGBT rights, regulation of new forms of reproduction, including both contraception and abortion on the one hand, and new forms of reproduction on the other, including egg donation, sperm donation, surrogacy, transsexuality. The Vatican, the difference between me and the Vatican is we see the same things, we see them as connected in the same way, but their dreams are my nightmares, their nightmares are my dreams. That was particularly true of the Pope Emeritus, Benedict XVI, And one of the things I have been disappointed by is that Pope Francis, who began his papacy by saying, on the one hand, we can't stress these sexual and reproductive things that aren't that connected and obsess about them, has nevertheless also specifically spoken against the use of the English word gender in exactly the kind of ways that trouble me. So in a conference on the state of the European Union, what I'm particularly interested in is the way in which the Vatican has mobilized its resources, by which I mean its political resources, its intellectual resources, its capacity as the Holy See, and its position as what Benedict XVI described in an important statement to the bishops on the collaboration of men and women in the church and the world, as the church's role as an expert in humanity. In all of these very different modalities, the Vatican has set its face against, I've got to say, everything I stand for. It has successfully, in a variety of countries, from Poland, where gender was, according to the New York Times, the word of the year in 2013, to France, where the decision to implement same-sex marriage led, on the one hand, to hundreds of thousands of people protesting in the streets in the Mani pour tous, and protesting under slogans such as, "Don't touch our stereotypes," to the French National Assembly, which opposed education about the concept of gender being something that was not necessarily coterminous with sex, was something that people learned, to the European Union, where reports on on sexual education, reports on equality, have been stymied by the Vatican. So in each of these very different environments, the Vatican and people under its influence have been enormously influential. And it's particularly interesting to me as an American and a comparativist, because I think of as the person responsible for the use of the word gender as the Vatican has opposed it, not Judith Butler, who is very often demonized for this, but instead the much more respectable and legal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who some of you who are at the EUI may have recalled sitting in this very room a few seats over from me. It was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg who is responsible for the use of the word gender being synonymous with the word sex in American law. The way she describes her own account, and she is single-handedly responsible for the American constitutional law of sex discrimination, is she says she had a secretary who would say to her, "Don't use the word sex, it makes people think of porn theaters. Use the word gender, it's a neutral term." So one of the things that fascinates me as an analytical matter is you have two very different uses of the word gender. You have Ruth Bader Ginsburg's, where gender and sex are synonymous, and you have the use of the word gender as familiar to those in women's studies, not just Judith Butler, but possibly many of you in this room, where gender and sex are very different, where gender is to sex, as masculine and feminine are to male and female, but what they have in common, and disturbs the Vatican, is that each of them start from the proposition that there is some fluidity, there is some flexibility, there is some choice in the relationship between gender and sex. And my research project has tried to trace this back as far as possible. I've seen that Ratzinger, before he was Benedict XVI, was as early as 1983, and before he had the word gender to attach to this, connecting up in ways that, again, I agree with, except for the normative valence, connecting up transsexuality, new forms of family formation, new forms of reproductive technologies, the whole of the agenda that is associated with LGBT rights of activists and feminist activists. And he said, this is terrible. He says, it sounds in the first instance very appealing, but it's really very dangerous because it suggests that the human can create him or herself. Now, whenever I do these events, I come in costume. Here I am wearing blue, Mary's color, because it's the month of May. But in recent years, the month of May has begun with the feast day of St. Joseph the Worker, which is part of Pope Francis's, well, I mean, predates Pope Francis, but it fits very nicely into Pope Francis's reinstantiation of the patriarchal family from the Vatican. So one of the first things that the otherwise very appealing Pope Francis did was introduce into the liturgy of the Catholic Church St. Joseph. You already had Mary and the 12 apostles. From my perspective as a feminist, the ratio of women to men, 1 to 12, not so great. But if you add into that St. Joseph, her husband, and suddenly there is no woman without male authority, there is no woman outside of the patriarchal family, that's particularly disturbing. But I will complete my costume by saying one of the things that has motivated the Vatican to be opposed to the word gender is the recent, I've dated this in recently published writing that makes me a peer-reviewed theologian, something that has never been one of my life's ambitions, to the middle of the 20th century. In the middle of the 20th century, the popes invented what they are now saying is the theological anthropology of the Roman Catholic Church, which is complementarity. I am wearing on my left wrist my little swatch with the emblem of complementarity. It's got an unhappy heterosexual couple with a dominant male, and a snake is heading toward them. On my opposite wrist, I'm wearing my human bracelet, which is the alternative that, again, Benedict XVI has described as very appealing but very dangerous. Those of you who are historians will know that the doctrine of complementarity on which the Vatican is relying is a 20th century innovation, cannot be traced to the Middle Ages, cannot be traced to the Gospels, cannot be traced to the fathers of the Church, but it has been very effectively mobilized, not so much to persuade Catholics as believers to abide by it, but precisely to intervene in the arenas relevant to this State of the Union, that is, in secular law. And my concern is this intervention in secular law. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for this very stimulating opening to our panel, which is precisely about unsettling some of the gender norms that are circulating right now and being recirculated by different instantiations of the right. And the Vatican is a particularly interesting instance of this. Our next speaker is Elena Brodeala, who is currently a PhD researcher in law at the EUI. She's working under the supervision of Ruth Rubio, who will be giving the keynote speech tomorrow. And her project deals with issues related to gender and the law in Romania and other Central and East European countries. She was previously a visiting researcher at the Central European University in Budapest and has pursued different courses in law and gender at the University of Oslo in Norway, at the Lucian Blaga University from Sibiu, Romania, and the University of Akureyri in Iceland. She also attended different conferences and study visits in the fields of human rights, gender studies, and Europeanization in several countries, including France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Austria, Sweden, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Your trajectory makes me tired. So Elena is going to speak to us a little bit about, in kind of some continuity with some of the themes that Marianne raised, about what's going on in present-day Poland right now around the idea of gender, and then she's going to move back into the demonishly secular Romanian Socialist Republic and its population politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction and for organizing this panel. And indeed, I think my presentation works very well with what you were saying, because in fact, what I was planning to talk about is how also a secular state could aim to have control over the meaning of gender relations in a certain society, and how it's not only the church. And I changed just a little bit the order of my presentation, because I was thinking that before talking about what's happening today in Poland and how they are still discussing today in 2016 a total ban on abortion, it would be nice to know what are the lessons to be learned from socialist Romania. That, as probably you already know, had one of the toughest anti-abortion laws in Europe. And I will start by telling you that in Romanian language there is a word that doesn't exist in any other language, and this is decreței, which is translate children of the decree. And it refers to the children that were born due to Ceausescu's anti-abortion law that put a legal end to all kinds of abortion. This decree was adopted in 1966. Its purpose was to counter the demographic crisis that was affecting Eastern Europe in that period. And of course, it was also aimed to enforce the new socialist morality that I will discuss further on. Hand in hand with criminalizing abortion, the regime also imposed penal sanctions. So, for example, if a woman was discovered to have an illegal abortion, she was subject to up to 2 years in prison, while the person who helped her have an abortion was subject to up to 14 years in prison. There was, however, 5 exceptions in which women were allowed to have abortion. And I chose to make 3 categories. The first category of those exceptions are the exceptions in which countries that generally ban abortion on request are usually making exceptions. And those are the case in which the pregnancy threatens the life of the mother or her health, or the case when the pregnancy is the result of an unlawful act as rape or incest. And to date, in the European Union, there are 2 countries that are currently banning abortion on request and allowing only in these exceptions, and this is Poland and Cyprus. The second category I chose to make is a category that is very specific to communist Romania, and it concerns eugenics, because the regime did not only wanted to have children and increase the number of the population, the regime wanted to create the new man. And the new man was supposed to be a healthy child who could become later the socialist worker. Moreover, it has to be an ethnical Romanian. Therefore, abortion was also allowed in case that parents had an hereditary illness that could be transmitted to the children, in case women had a physical or psychological disability, and informally, Roma women were allowed to have abortion. Moreover, the regime did not target the Hungarian communities living in Romania through their propaganda that aimed to convince women to become mothers. And the third category has to do with what I was talking about as socialist morality, what I was naming socialist morality. And this has to do with how they see the ideal socialist family. And I think it goes very well with how the Catholic Church sees the ideal traditional family. Therefore, they allowed abortion for women that were older than 45, or for women that already had 4 children, meaning that the ideal socialist family had to have at least 5 children. And they were rewarding women who had at least 4 children by giving what it was known as heroine mothers medals, of which probably you already know. And they were also sanctioning people and citizens who did not conform to the ideal they wanted. Therefore, citizens older than 25 who did not have children had to pay what was called celibacy tax. And the problem with prohibiting abortion was that prohibiting abortion did not come with any other welfare support for child rearing. The caretaking facilities in Romania at that time were underdeveloped. Thus, the creches and kindergarten became quickly overcrowded. Moreover, there was no parental leave, unlike in other Central and Eastern European countries that time. There was only a very short maternity leave, so only women could take it as a clear sign that care was a task of women. There was no program whatsoever to involve men in caretaking, and Alice here will discuss more about the importance of redefining fatherhood to promote gender equality. Moreover, we have also to discuss the issue of contraception. Contraception that time in Romania was not banned, however, was not available, and most of the people did not know about its existence. In addition, there were no laws to protect women from violence, and because the communist regime thought that the ideal family, so I will complete a bit the idea of the ideal family, was the heterosexual, monogamous, lifelong marriage, was based on marriage, did not allow divorces, or divorces in communist Romania were very hard to obtain. As a way of consequences, an extremely big network of underground illegal abortions were developed. And of course, the means of provoking abortions had nothing to do with medical practice. The consequences were disastrous. It is estimated that in 23 years of the existence of Decree 770, 10,000 women died because of illegal abortions, 2,000 women ended up in prisons, and many others faced serious health and psychological consequences. Therefore, in Romania, women are declared victims of communism. Moreover, the fall of communism brought into light the inhumane situation of unwanted children that were placed in public orphanages. It is not surprising in this context that the second measure after the outbreak of the Romanian Revolution was to legalize abortion on request. So, basically what happens is that on December 25th, 1989, the Ceausescus are executed, and the second day abortion becomes legal, to understand the urgency of the situation. In this way, abortion in Romania becomes a symbol of democracy. But democracy in Romania also was seen as encompassing returning to Europe. And how else to return to Europe than through European integration? And talking about the EU, today, in 2016, we still have Poland that debates banning abortion. And here I think I have to explain to you that already abortion on request is banned in Poland. So Poland is one of those countries that allowed abortions only in situation when it threatens mother's health, when there is a fetus abnormality, or when the pregnancy is the result of an unlawful act as rape or incest. The media coverage, however, talks about Ceausescu and connects it to the Polish case. However, there seems that there is not enough learning on this. And protest in solidarity, so what you see here, it's a picture from a protest in Warsaw on women reclaiming choice. And protests took also place in other big European countries, like in London, Paris, or Oslo. But they also took place in Romania, and the message from Romania, as you could expect, is just different. And here you see Romanian activists protesting in front of the Polish embassy in Bucharest. And what you can see at the picture on your right, or my right, is comparing Elena Ceausescu, so the wife of Nicolae Ceausescu, because here it also has to be mentioned that they were ruling together, that's why they were executed together, which of course opens a new discussion about the role of women in politics. And they are comparing her with the Prime Minister of Poland, who is currently supporting the abortion ban, and it asks, what is the difference? And of course, it's not the first time Romanian women try to make their voice heard and to bring their experience out to the world so they would prevent the history that they experience would repeat in other contexts. And here I have another example. In 2013-2014, when Spain was discussing restricting abortion, Romanian women once again went to the Spanish embassy in Bucharest and compare the Minister of Justice that time that had this initiative with Ceausescu. Because they hoped that the learning could also go from west to the east, or as others would say, from what we call periphery to the center. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, for that very stimulating and exciting presentation. We are now going to lurch away from issues around reproductive rights and toward the question of the rights of fathers with Alicia Margaria's presentation. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Fundamental Rights Laboratory at the University of Turin, and her projects concern the impact of assisted reproductive technologies on the determination of legal parenthood. So maybe we're not really lurching away from reproductive rights, but just looking at it in a different register. She is also a lecturer at the Koç University Law School in Istanbul, where she teaches a course on gender, sexuality, and human rights. And her presentation today shares some of the findings of her doctoral thesis, which she completed last year at the EUI, that analyzed the definition of fatherhood that has been endorsed by the European Court of Human Rights. And a revised version of this work is coming out next year in an article entitled New Fathers and the Right to Parental Leave. Is the European Court of Human Rights satisfied with just breadwinning? And this is coming out in Harding and Fletcher and Beasley's Revaluing Care in Theory, Law, and Policy, Cycles and Connections. It'll be out in 2017, so coming to a bookstore near you.
So first of all, I would like to thank you very much for being here today. I would like to thank the scientific committee, Professor Laura Duns, Professor Ruth Rubio-Marin, my former supervisor, for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure and honor to be one of the speakers at this particularly special event, so I'm really happy to be here. So we're witnessing multiple social changes affecting the family, in this regard not only women but also men, with significant implications on the functioning of the traditional family. While the male breadwinner model had started to decline already at the end of the 20th century, work-family conflicts have become a policy concern in more recent times. Moreover, an overemphasis on the public domain has often resulted in measures which conceive the attainment of gender equality in the public sphere as completely independent from any change in the private realm of parenthood. In other words, in Europe, family-work reconciliation has often been synonymous with accommodating women in the public sphere, and therefore fathers have been largely left out of the debate. In so doing, this model has produced an incomplete revolution. Not only, this has also reinforced a stereotypical association of care with femininity, therefore supporting traditional patterns of work distribution within the family. So in this presentation, I will briefly discuss the reaction of the European Court of Human Rights, another important actor in the struggle for gender equality in Europe, to changed employment patterns. More specifically, I will talk about the position of the court in the debate around fatherhood and the right to parental leave. In this presentation, I would like to make 2 points, 2 main points, interrelated. The first one is that over the last 15 years, the definition of fatherhood endorsed by the European Court of Human Rights has shifted from the male breadwinner model that equates fatherhood to just breadwinning to the ideology of new fatherhood. This new ideology stresses that fathers are not, or at least not just primary breadwinners, but are also and increasingly hands-on carers, are individuals who are, or at least should be, emotionally engaged and involved in the day-to-day care of their children. The second point that I would like to make is that the redefinition of fatherhood within the European Courts of Human Rights jurisprudence has been the product of the progressive establishment of a European consensus in the field of parental leave. So in other words, the court felt ready to adopt a definition of fatherhood departing from the male breadwinner model only when this new definition was approved by the majority of states in the Council of Europe. So let's develop these 2 points a bit more. So in its first case, that was Petrovic versus Austria, decided in 1998, the court concluded that excluding fathers from the right to parental leave did not constitute a form of sex discrimination, because at that time, the majority of states in the Council of Europe had different legislative approaches to the issue of parental leave. And therefore, Austria, that was the country concerned in this case, enjoyed a wide margin of appreciation in shaping its own regulation on parental leave. In so arguing, the court de facto upheld a traditional division of labor according to which care is the responsibility of mothers, while fathers' roles is mere economic provision. In its most recent case, the Markin versus Russia, decided in 2012, the court reached the opposite outcome. In this case, parental leave was reserved to military service women because, according to the Russian government, this was justified by the special role played by motherhood in raising children. The Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights decided that Russia did not enjoy the same amount of freedom that Austria enjoyed back in 1998. Why? Because society had evolved since 1998, and in 2012, the majority of states in the Council of Europe provided for parental leave to both mothers and fathers. Therefore, Russia was required to put forward very weighty reasons to justify the exclusion of fathers from the right to parental leave. But the court didn't stop there. It went on to state that gender stereotypes cannot justify differential treatment, and concluded that granting the right to parental leave to mothers only in line with conventional gender roles constituted a form of sex discrimination. By supporting the idea that men should be as involved as women in childcare, the court seems to suggest that care is no longer the sole or the primary responsibility of women, and that breadwinning does no longer fall within the exclusive competence of men. Rather, in the court's view, policies that make parental leave available to both men and women should be fostered because they facilitate a more equal sharing of financial and childcare responsibilities, traditionally undertaken along gender lines. The extension of parental leave to fathers is therefore viewed as a means of supporting the establishment of the desirable dual carer, dual earner family model. As I mentioned before, the driving force behind the redefinition of fatherhood within the European Courts of Human Rights jurisprudence has been the progressive development of a European consensus or a European common ground in the field of parental leave. What do I mean by common ground? I mean an increasingly widespread awareness that gender equality is a human rights issue and that gender equality has to be realized both in the private and in the public sphere. And consequently, an increased number of states in the Council of Europe providing for parental leave to both men and women. What impact has this common ground or this European consensus had? European consensus worked as an empowering tool in the jurisprudence of the court, not only by reducing the margin of maneuver of each state, but also, and more interestingly, by influencing the type of reasoning used by the court to substantiate its findings. The court felt prepared to take an openly critical attitude towards the justifications put forward by Russia, and among other things, held a differential treatment of servicemen liable for perpetuating traditional gender roles to the detriment of both men's family life and women's professional career. Therefore, opposite to its first judgment, in this case, the court discards references to a gender division of labor as insufficient justification for discrimination and refuses the stereotypical images of the man breadwinner and the woman homemaker as determining factors in the allocation of the right to parental leave. To conclude, as a consequence of the empowering power of European consensus, the court has been able to embark on an anti-stereotyping analysis, starting to bring equality not only in the public sphere, but also in the private sphere. However, vis-à-vis data indicating relatively low, although increasing, parental leave take-up rates by men in European societies, the questions are: can anti-stereotyping provide enough sensitivity to context? How far can anti-stereotyping go in a context where it is often the logic of gender choices instead of individual desires that determines who takes the leave? Is the framework of rights enough to change patterns of family labor, or should the state also impose duties to achieve this aim? So I leave these questions to the floor, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alicia, for this very stimulating and rich talk. We are going to finish, or perhaps start, the debate with a talk by Stefano Osella, who is a second-year researcher in law at the EUI, where he's working on a PhD project aimed at analyzing the constitutional management of sexual and gender diversity in Western Europe. And you will see what this means when he actually presents his paper. His fields of specialization are administrative and constitutional law, human rights, and comparative law, disciplines in which he has already published several articles. Previously, Stefano has worked in legal practice and as a research assistant at the University of Turin. He studied at the University of Turin, at the Georgetown Law Center, and at the University of Oxford. So, take it away, Stefano.
Thank you, Laura. So I want to start with thanksgiving. First of all, I want to thank Laura, as I already said, for her continuous and never-ending inspiration. I want to thank the other speakers. I want to thank the scientific committee. It's going to take a bit long, but I've just been told that we are like one speaker less, so I can thank more people. I want to thank my supervisor, who is there, and also I want to thank my partner, Carlo, who is there and who is supporting me all the time. So, I mean, the biggest thank goes to him. That said, what we learned from the previous presentation is that men and women are the holders of rights and duties, which still are differentiated according to sex. The system of gendered legal status relies on a presupposition, so the exclusive, and I want to emphasize this word, the exclusive existence of two defined and natural sexes, male and female, to which different rights and duties are distributed. This is true in family law. As we have heard, different rights and duties in the family are given on the basis of gender. Also, in most jurisdictions, only different sex couples can marry. But the presence of the sexual binary as a legal presupposition goes beyond the family. It invests the public dimension of the law under many aspects. For instance, anti-discrimination law. Only women, not men, can be elected with electoral quotas, to give just one example. However, sexual reality is way more complex than it may prima facie seem. The presence of the two genders, male and female, does not exhaust the multiplicity of identities that go beyond maleness and femaleness. To begin with, some individuals are simply born with physical characteristics that make very difficult, or even impossible, their classification as males or females. These persons, intersex persons, constitute a living puzzle for the legal order, which cannot recognize their neither masculine nor feminine identity. Whom can they marry? Can they enjoy of the anti-discrimination protection granted to women? Can they serve in the military? At what age can they retire? Should they be jailed in male or female prisons? What toilet shall they use? In Western society, these persons have been mostly perceived as problematic and extraneous to the general categories, maleness and femaleness again, which contribute to make the person intelligible to the legal system. Intersex persons have been subject to a process of pathologization which, and this is historically demonstrated, is grounded in the social anxiety they generate. This pathologization is the conceptual origin of the medical procedure of normalization to which they are usually subject. Through medical and surgical procedures, their anatomies are standardized to fit into the masculine-feminine paradigm. Legal orders certainly rely on this pathologization to maintain the stability of gendered rights and duties. Indeed, the law is generally silent about normalizing procedures. Most of the time, it does not officially require nor discourage them. In some other cases, as the Italian case, the law, the soft law in fact, explicitly requires normalization, of which the state benefits. Indeed, normalizing therapies have the effect of reshaping and stabilizing unusual morphologies, therefore stabilizing also the identity of non-intelligible individuals. Intersex persons, it must be said, are not the only ones blurring the boundaries between maleness and femaleness. Other persons, born this time with standard anatomies, may develop an identity which we perceive in contrast to their body. We refer to these persons as trans, usually transsexual or transgender, individuals. The case for the recognition of their rights has been characterized by problems which are very similar to the ones I mentioned before. Trans persons raise indeed a bigger problem and a more conceptual one. May individuals self-ascribe their gender? What of the rights and duties based on gender to which they were assigned? In the early 70s, the first application for gender recognition started to be lodged. All over Europe, transsexual applicants wanted to have their gender identity recognized, new ID issued, and their legal gender corrected in the civil registries, usually with little success. In Italy, judges, who were in charge to decide, used to reject these applications. On the one hand, courts saw gender as fixed at childbirth on the basis of purely anatomical factors, so there was a more cultural reason. Changing sex was simply unconceivable. But on the other hand, courts were explicitly claiming that consent in gender reclassification would have hindered the certainty of legal relations, an expression which essentially sums up the legal hurdles that I have mentioned. When gender legal classification became possible, precise conditions were imposed on it. First, the pathologization of trans identity, that is, the need to have a psychiatric diagnosis. Second, the transformation of the body. It does not really matter that, in many cases, bodily transformation are desired by the applicant. They may be desired, but they are also explicitly required by the law. Individuals must acquire the physical appearance of the opposite sex by transforming their body through hormonal and surgical therapies. Also, they must acquire the stereotyped behavior, dress, hair, manners, typical, quote-unquote, of the desired gender. And again, now I'm talking about Italy, but this can be said about all of the European countries. Why is that so? This medicalization, which is arguably imposed, but certainly relied on by the law, is necessary to stabilize gender identity. This is to avoid that individuals may change their gender at their will, if not in certain specific and medicalized circumstances. Medicalization is necessary to be sure that only certain persons can be reclassified. Medicalization, then, serves the function to minimize the possibility of reassignment. This, of course, to prevent individuals from self-ascribing gender and escaping their gender rights and duties. Now we have some final questions. First, is the system of gender classification still pursuing a legitimate purpose? Many of the governance purposes seem now to be outdated, or at least debatable. For instance, it is debatable whether gender fixity can still be used to preserve the heterosexual metrics of marriage. On the other hand, the anti-discrimination purposes may constitute a reason to preserve the classification of individuals as men and women. So in fact, we understand that the question evolves. The point is not the classification per se, but rather the medicalization of it. Shall the classification of individuals really reflect an externally imposed physical reality? Could not we leave the feeling and the control of the very body to the autonomy of the individuals? What would be the legal detriment of having a demedicalized system of classification, disconnected from a mechanism of biopolitical control? I leave this question to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. So we've landed in the belly of the 20th century beast, where eugenics and the heterosexual couple and the control of fertility and biopolitics have been kind of the rule of the day. So we have a lot of time for discussion. I'm sure you have many, many questions, and I know that behind each of these talks lies years of thought and scientific reflection. So please, yes. Why don't you come here? Oh, there's a microphone. Okay. There's one right next to you. I get to sit at the table. Yeah, come to the table.
Well, first of all, thank you for really excellent presentations. It was a delight to hear, even the sadder stories, and I want to congratulate all the speakers on such great work that they're doing. My question, or sort of two questions, are actually addressed to Elena. And of the many interesting things that you've said, I've picked up this statement that abortion in Romania is perceived, or was perceived in 1989 as an element of democracy. And I thought that was very, very interesting to rethink the debates in those terms rather than in the perhaps more typical language of rights. So the two questions I had were one, how has this fared in Romanian constitutional discourse and jurisprudence? And I'm particularly interested in whether it's holding up. So this association or this perception of abortion as linked to democracy as opposed to rights, is that holding up over time? Or, and even if it is, do you envision an erosion perhaps as memory of communist times fades, as perhaps sort of transnational constitutional discourse and imagination is, protrudes or permeates in Romania as well? So that's the first question. And the second one was, what of the other aspects that you mentioned of the communist experience, the absence of parental leave, the absence of social services and so on, were those excluded from this sort of democratic empowerment of Romanian women? Was abortion such a strong symbol that it became the only symbol of their empowerment after the revolution? So what's the state of that development? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for your questions. I think I can provide a very long answer. So to start with, so I'll start the other way around. So no, it's not only abortion and the regime of abortion that changes after communism, and I think this is extremely interesting, and I think it's rather a regional trend that you discuss about this backlash against communism and all the changes it's bring. And for instance, in Romania, what is interesting, because at the current moment there is a parental leave of 2 years, and we know that Central and Eastern Europe are quite famous for these very long parental leaves, and we know, for instance, that in Hungary it comes from the 60s, so this is how they try to counter the demographic crisis. In the Czech Republic is the same. In Romania, however, the long parental leaves were adopted after the fall of the regime. So basically they, in 90, so after 6 months after the revolution, they introduced this 1-year-long parental leave, which might be also connected with the idea of women going back to care, and not to the factory that was forced on them by the communist regime. Regarding the memory and whether Romanian people still remember today those times, certainly women who lived under regime, they do. Politicians who lived under regime, they do, and you see it in the discourse that they have. about the young generations, that's a different story. And also, I think it has to be mentioned in the case of Romania, the gap that exists between the legal framework, which is very liberal on abortion and reproductive rights, and the social reality or the mentalities. And I've seen recently a research done by the Open Society Institute on attitudes. And the surprise was to see that Romania, I think it was the 5th, so basically the most conservative in terms of abortion, I think it was Italy. No, I think it was Ireland, Poland, Italy, Malta, so countries that either had a very strong Catholic tradition, either already criminalized abortion. And then it was Romania. So then it's again another discussion whether this kind of, being conservative was a kind of resistance to the communist regime and whether it persisted or whether they wanted to go back to the pre-communist times. So I think it's an entire discussion and argument that can be still developed. Regarding the rights and the constitutional debate, this is a very complex matter. First of all, the Romanian Constitutional Court does not have a doctrine in the sense, for instance, the US Supreme Court has or Western courts. I was able to find only one decision on reproductive rights. It did not concern abortion per se. It was about assisted reproduction and the new technologies. They were discussing, however, the right of the mother to have an abortion or not. And I found it extremely interesting because, generally Constitutional Court, if you look, Germany, Hungary, or other, they usually make, they balance rights. And it was very interesting in the Romanian decision, there was no discussion whatsoever, is it the fetus versus the woman, so it was almost taken for granted, it's about women's autonomy and we don't debate this. So it was a very short, of course, the Romanian Constitutional Court, following the French way of writing, has very short arguments. So it's very hard to really understand what was the philosophy behind. And of course, and you were talking about rights. And I think this is another discussion because the research I did, for instance, on the pro-life movements in Romania, that they try to bring, and the pro-life movements in Romania are actually translation of the US pro-life movements in a Romanian context, and they do talk about rights, it's about the right of the fetus to life, but the problem is, in the legal culture of Romania, and I think it's Eastern Europe, is not so much about rights, and it's because of the socialist legacy. So also in socialist times, abortion was not discussed in terms of rights, it was discussed in terms of demography, of poverty. So it was a totally different philosophy. And this is also, I think, one of the, the obstacles, in imposing this kind of discourses.
Fascinating. Yes, we have a question from you, and anybody who wants to raise a hand, I'll note you down.
Yes, hello. I'm not so much in gender studies, but I'm absolutely fascinated by many of the propositions made here, and I wanted also to come back a bit to this Romanian case study. My memory, and I come from Austria, is a bit different, not so much about Romania, but about the other Eastern Bloc countries. And I wanted to ask you if there wasn't a big difference, for example, between Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania and the Soviet Union. I studied Slavic languages, and I lived in the Soviet Union twice. My memory there is that abortion was part and parcel of everyday life and certainly wasn't at all disciplined and regulated or forbidden like you suggest in Romania. There must have been other terrible things connected with it, but it was just very different. I also remember women from Austria, where it was still forbidden at that time in the 60s, traveling to Czechoslovakia to have abortion, where it was also possible, but it was not possible in Catholic Austria, because the right for women to choose was only in the 70s when the socialist majority won, and all these agenda were put through. So I was wondering about the differences. I don't think it's related to communism so much as to the Romanian special case. And I'm wondering also if it draws on the fascist past of Romania, because some of the things you mentioned, like the mother's medal, yeah, when they get those 4 or 5 kids, reminds me of the German mother, and you know, the Deutsche Mutter with, and all these things. So I was wondering if there is some connection, not so much only to communism, but to the time before.
Thank you very much. I think it's absolutely a great point, because indeed Romania is exceptional in the region, and Romania is exceptional in the region because communism, if we can call it communism, because that's another discussion, was different. And to go back a bit, so for instance, Russia in 1920s is the first country in Europe to legalize abortion. Then you have Yugoslavia in 1970s, is the first country, as far as I know, in Europe that put reproductive rights in their constitution. So it's Article 191 that, you know, still exists today in some former republics. You have, again, Czechoslovakia, which is very liberal, and is liberal also because of the ideology behind the communist regimes, and also because, you don't have the church that is an important actor, and so on. And this actually, in the region, brings a kind of backlash after the fall of the regime. And then you have the case of Poland that was very liberal, and then they criminalize because the Catholic Church comes back. And what happens in Romania, so Romania, at the beginning of communism, so after 1948, used to be a very liberal society. The situation changes when Ceausescu comes to power, because he imposes a very nationalistic version of communism. So they start promoting national myths and all these kind of narratives that go back in history. And Romania, it's a very interesting case, because Romania is the country that had the fewest members in the Communist Party, and even so, it enforced the most repressive communist system in the region. Yeah, and I think we have to discuss Romania separately by the other countries. And of course, the conversation could still go on other differences. Because, for instance, you speak about the Cold War. So Ceausescu was refusing to invade Czechoslovakia in 1968 in the Prague Spring. And also abortion for him was a way to distance from Soviet Union. Everybody had it legal, but not himself. Nixon visits Romania in the 70s, so it's a whole debate.
This is a question for Marianne. Gender is understood and used in law now in a way. So do you think it's still useful as a category to fight discrimination?
Question of the use of the word gender, and then there's the question of the various things gender can be thought to stand for. So I was interested in hearing from some of the other presentations discussion of stereotypes. I, as an American, have come to think of the real problem with sex-respecting rules, rules that distinguish between males and females in law, to be a problem of stereotypes. And therefore, I find it enormously paradoxical for the Manif pour tous to march under the banner, touche pas nos stéréotypes, don't touch our stereotypes, with a picture of a little boy superhero and a little girl in a princess costume. So I find useful both of the two halves of the meaning of gender. That is to say, both the Ruth Bader Ginsburg half, which says, let us strip down in law to have a thin definition of sex, so that sex is really nothing more but the basis of a foundation of a claim of discrimination. If you did not think of me as in one sex or another, you would not have done to me what you did, dear state, dear employer, dear other source of discrimination. But then come to the women's studies point and say sex and gender are different parts of the same whole, and you have a thicker definition of gender, but one that is not, contrary to Ratzinger, fixing us, but rather in a way that Ratzinger worries about, leaving us free. So I think gender is still a useful concept. I think one of the difficulties is that there are two contradictory ways in which it has proven to be useful.
I actually would like to abuse my post as chair here and pose a question to Marianne, because I want us to sort of continue the discussion about the way the church gets into this game very late. I mean, I think it tells us a lot about the politics of the 19th century, the post-French Revolution politics, and the way that the church has to reposition itself once you have a Republican state, or, you know, something that aspires to be a Republican state, taking over aggressively, and this is particularly true after 1870, taking over aggressively things that the church had handled: social protection, education, the family. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about this late 19th, early 20th century shift from the idea that, in the traditional Catholic idea, that the family, it's better to marry than to burn, you know, to suddenly to this idea that the Catholics better get a hold of, not the Catholics, the church, better get a hold of the family, because otherwise it's the secular state that's going to do so.
So thank you for this. I mean, here's my problem. I am someone who, as a lawyer, has studied the present and the future, and as a feminist theorist have studied the very early history of feminism. So one of the things that has fascinated me about what the church is doing when it puts up this vision of complementarity, that is to say, men and women are all the way down different. They are biologically and psychologically and in their soul and in their body and in their mind really different, is that this is an innovation of the 20th century. Even its most enthusiastic proponents cannot find, for example, the word complementarity before the 20th century. And Thomas Lacour, who has written about the invention of sex, has suggested that, you know, it's only as a result of 19th century biology that we start thinking of male and female as not greater and less, but as different, right? So it's you know, on the one hand, I applaud the church for embracing the idea of equality and difference and trying to I mean, insisting on both of those two, difference on the one hand, but equality on the other. But on the other hand, simply as someone who does the history of ideas, I have to say that the medieval, that the early Renaissance view of the sexes was a lot closer to what the church is now setting its face against and what the 70s feminists were embracing, which is precisely, as Ratzinger says in a tone of some horror, that people can make of themselves what they will. I mean, I'm sitting here in Italy, think of Pico della Mirandola and the dignity of the human person, right? You know, what constitutes the dignity of the human being? It's precisely that they can make of themselves what they will. They can go up, down, and sideways. I mean, he's talking about the dignity of humanity as compared with the dignity of the angels or the dignity of the lower species. But exactly what the church denies today to men and women, which is the self-fashioning that is part of liberal feminism, has been part of the church and has gone, I would say, to liberal feminism from the church. So I'm particularly fascinated by the church renouncing its past. The other part of Laura's question, and she knows I'm obsessed with this and trying to learn more about it, and I invite any help I can get from the people in the audience, is when I look for the origins of complementarity, I do not find it where the Vatican would like me to, either in the long history of Catholic theological anthropology or even in the philosophers of the early 20th century. Where I find it is in the immediate post-war popes as they react to, for example, in Italy, the post-war opening of the vote to women. And then the question becomes, what are women, how do we incorporate women into the body politic? And again, this comes to one of my general points about the Vatican and gender, which is at least until we got to Pope Francis, who is in something like Amoris Laetitia, focusing on the church and the faithful. One of the fascinating paradoxes about the church's intervention in sex, gender, sexuality, and the family is that it was speaking as what it called an expert on humanity, that it was interested in influencing secular law, that it was not speaking to its faithful in terms of how they should behave, it was speaking to both its faithful and its hierarchy, telling them, go out there and change the law. Make sure the secular law is the way we want it to be, because in a quasi-Lacanian way, the law is what sets human understanding. And if capital T, capital L, the law, isn't in accord with what we want it to be, all of us can turn out psychotic. Sex distinctions in capital T, capital L law are what make thought possible. I mean, I'm ascribing this now to Lacan. They previously tried to ascribe it to Levi-Strauss, but unlike Lacan, Levi-Strauss was not dead. So he said, hey there, that's not what I meant at all, not at all. And Lacan couldn't do that.
I mean, there is actually an interesting prehistory to the Catholic use of complementarity, which goes back to the, again, I'm speaking very particularly about the case of France, where the battle was joined between an anti-clerical republic seeking to take over the public functions of the church, which it did very well. The church embattled, characterizing itself as an exile in its own land, and that's a quote, began to promote the notion of gender complementarity, but not as equal, but in a vertical way, and slowly kind of modified it, because the kind of paradox was that the French church, at least, didn't have very many male faithful. So the people who were going to church were women, and increasingly the church was relying on women to accomplish all kinds of spiritual and lay functions that the church had to accomplish in order to survive as a, not so much as the church, but through Catholic associations in a completely secularized society. So this idea of complementarity had a sort of first instantiation, but not about transforming secular law, but about trying to battle it in some sense. And what's interesting is the Second World War seems to be a moment where the church says, we give up.
So there's a whole lot in what you said, so let me just hit on a few high points. So first of all, my sense of the current theological anthropology of the church and complementarity is its attempt to square the circle, right? So even the proponents of complementarity, as they look back in the long history of the church from the fathers through the Middle Ages, through the early modern period, acknowledge that the people who were in favor of equality were generally in favor of sameness and the ability of humans, whatever their sex, to shape themselves as they will. And the people who favored, who believed there to be essential differences between the sexes thought that the sexes were essentially unequal. So the 20th century complementarity is attempting to square that circle, saying the sexes are equal, but they're different. Separate but equal, or different but equal, essentially different but equal. But I think it's also fascinating, your reference to the French. First, because as I look for traces of what became complementarity, I find them in Vichy French theorists. And secondly, if I'm going to press it back further, I find them in Rousseau. There is a very close analogy between what the opponents of the proponents of complementarity, the proponents of the money for tous are arguing in France, and what Rousseau was arguing, which is not that we are so essentially different that we can't be brought together, but that this very essentialism is fragile and needs to be supported. So as Émile and Sophie needed to be nurtured in their respective roles, and she needed to be given lots of sweet stuff so that she could stay sweet. A line I'm borrowing from the American fundamentalist Church of the Latter-day Saints, the polygamists who also keep their women down. They say, stay sweet is what women should do. In any event, I think there's so much in your question which is fascinating and important and interesting, but it all goes to the premise I begin with, which is that the Church's current view has no long-term history, that it is an invented tradition.
Yes, and I think that's crucially important, because the Church becomes a political player late in issues around abortion, for example. Again, to return to the case of France, the initial anti-abortionists were anti-clerical Republican doctors who wanted to push traditional medical players like midwives out of the circle, but who also felt that performing abortion was against the Hippocratic Oath. So they're basically setting up a set of ethics that is outside was at the time, which was up until around the 5th month, which is when quickening happens. It's called ensoufflement en français. It's the moment when God breathes a soul into the fetus. That's the moment when the baby starts to move. That's when the baby has a soul. Before that, it's not a human. It's something else. And so what happens before that, miscarriage, whatever, the Church didn't ask any questions about that. And so the people who began the campaign against abortion in France were Republican doctors, anti-clerical, and concerned about depopulation. So they didn't want women to control their own fertility because they were afraid that the French population was dropping. So the Church was also looking at all of this and seeing the whole politics of the family suddenly escaping to these kind of material, instrumental ends that the Church found very horrible. And a final point about Sophie, the pedagogy of Sophie, it isn't just to keep her sweet. The main thing, if you read the 5th chapter of the Émile on the education of Sophie, if she gets interested in anything, take her away from it in order to remind her that her fundamental job is to serve other people and not to be interested in anything herself. It's the opposite of the Émile pedagogy, which is to get him interested in things. She must serve.
Yeah, I will say complicating, I very carefully try and talk about the Vatican as opposed to the Church, because one of the interesting things about abortion politics is how diverse they are even within the Church. So, Laura mentioned that I published for a while on the German abortion debates, and the fascinating thing about the German abortion debates is that the compromised German abortion decision from the 90s, that is to say after unification, which allowed women to have abortions within the first trimester so long as they allowed state-sponsored counselors to try and talk them out of it first. This was embraced enthusiastically and with one dissenting voice by the German Bishops' Conference. And for the following decade, up to until the present, from the mid-90s to the present, the Vatican, through Ratzinger, through John Paul II, tried to get the German bishops were themselves participating in abortion counseling. They were really enthusiastic about this compromise solution, and their view is, you let us participate in counseling, we will save lives. And Ratzinger, on the other hand, had what I describe as a fundamentalist view, that is to say, a no compromises view, which is, you know, the most important thing is that your hands are clean. Not that lives are saved, but that your hands are not sullied in the process. And this has gone back and forth, starting with the Bishops' Conference, moving on to German lay people involved in the abortion decisions. So I'm mindful of this, as in Amoris Laetitia, Francis talks rather favorably about diversity within the church and the possibility of different jurisdictions taking different approaches, which of course licenses precisely the liberal German bishops who want to, for example, let their divorced and remarried communicants come to the altar to receive the sacrament. But I am old enough and traditional enough to say, to wonder what this does to one holy Catholic and apostolic church if there's now going to be this kind of local variation, and if all of the rights of issue to this panel, that is to say your sexual and your reproductive rights, are going to be a function of the attitude of your local bishop as opposed to the church as a whole.
Could I just humbly suggest that that's the history of the church up until the point where it became technically possible to impose one holy Catholic and apostolic church?
We should talk.
Thank you. I'm also going to jump in on this issue about abortion as well. So it's a question or more a comment for Elena. And I was just thinking when you were speaking about this contrast between the kind of authoritarian, in this case, not state socialist, but exists in other cases as well, kind of attitude towards abortion, and how distinct that is from restrictive abortion regimes in capitalist democracies. So when we're talking about kind of Catholic attitudes towards abortion, it seems to me that abortion regimes in countries like Ireland or Poland, as they exist today, are not understood to apply universally. They apply to a certain type of woman. So philosophically, they apply to women who aren't morally correct, women who have failed. In practice, they apply to poor women, women who don't have the legal status to leave the country, women who are not 18 years of age. Whereas in Romania, it seems from the way you presented it that it was understood to apply universally. So this is perhaps why there's this distinction with Romanian pro-choice movement being associated with democracy and this kind of universal right for women. Whereas in Ireland, I know from experience that it's not understood by everyone to be an attack on women. Far from it. It's actually understood to be a much more complex issue, even by people who are pro-choice, who have to a large extent adopted the language of the church and the pro-life movement because it's so hegemonic within our culture. So I think that's quite an interesting distinction to draw.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. I actually want to answer to something you said, because indeed, it did not apply, even in Romania, this law did not apply the same to all women, because there were women who were wives of members of the Communist Party, for example, so they were, for them it was easier to get illegal abortions than it was, for women at the countryside, for instance, or for women who had no connection whatsoever with the party, or for those women it was easier to go unpunished, And also there is something else about Romania, because today, for instance, when we discuss about Poland, Polish women, travel to the Netherlands, to Germany, to Slovenia, the same with Irish women traveling to the UK. Well, at that time, the borders were closed, so basically there was not the same freedom of movement we are discussing today in Europe, and obviously this had a very great impact. And it's interesting, for instance, there are the stories about smuggling contraception, Because, for instance, there are ethnographic studies showing how women from the Hungarian minority had, in fact, access to contraception because their connection to Hungary. And there are a lot of myths and realities about the contraceptions coming from Hungary and how did they function or not function and so on. And also, for instance, women at the borders of Romania, they were much more likely to get contraception than women living in the center. So obviously these differences still apply to the Romanian case too.
I thought maybe, oh yes, you have a question. Great, dive in.
I actually have a question regarding the parental leave issue. I understand that you were dealing with the case law and how the definition of fatherhood has changed. I was wondering from the policy-making perspective how this impacts and what are the connections with public opinion, because we noticed that from the policy perspective, more and more countries try to introduce a certain type of parental leave that only fathers can take. And for example, in the Central and Eastern European countries, there's actually a huge resistance on the society side. Why is the state inserting itself into such an issue, and fathers don't need this? So there's a certain resistance. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this or have researched this issue, what impact the policymaking has on public opinion and vice versa.
Thank you very much for your question. It's true that there is an increasing trend, but I guess it's still a minority of states that are like introducing parental leave policies that include a portion of the leave that is not transferable. This is definitely, I think one of the steps that has in some contexts proved to be effective, efficient, for instance, in Sweden. Still, as you said, it's true. I think the change is also to take place in the public opinion because, we have many data sources proving the fact that men, even if they have the right to take the parental leave, they don't take it. I think it can be due to many factors. First of all, lack of information, in my opinion. As you said, resistance, not just from the society in general, but also resistance from the employers. That definitely has an impact. So of course, notions of masculinities that somehow keep fatherhood, keep manhood far from care, from nurturing. I guess just providing for parental leave, including parental leave policies, including a portion that is non-transferable, might not be enough in the sense that, for instance, if I look at the Swedish case, they kind of added something else, like for instance, incentives. So if parents decide to share the parental leave in an equal way, like 50-50, then you have a number of extra days that you can take. You have also a bonus in terms of remuneration. So I think that possibly if you add incentives to the non-transferable portion of parental leave, it might be more successful. I guess it's also interesting, it's true my presentation was about parental leave, but I think it's really important also to discuss paternity leave. Of course, serves a different purpose, covers a different time period that is immediately after childbirth, so can be compared to maternity leave in a way, in the sense that it covers the same time period, while parental leave tends to cover a period that follows maternity and paternity leave. And so here the situation, I guess, is more concerning in a way, because if we look at paternity leave provisions in European countries, the duration of paternity leave, if provided, is much shorter than maternity leave. If we think about the EU directive providing for at least 2 weeks of compulsory maternity leave, of course, this has raised serious concerns about the fact that it's true, it's true that like mothers have special needs in that particular period because they've given birth, but obviously conveys the message that maternity deserves a special protection compared to paternity, compared to fatherhood. So I guess definitely like focusing on parental leave policies to make them somehow more appealing to men and to families in general is an important step. But I guess that like the issue of paternity leave needs to be discussed more than it actually is right now. Thank you.
We've told ourselves is, women need to recover from labor, and the children need to bond with mother, and women are breastfeeding. And somehow we added that all together, and it kind of ended up in, maternity leave and mandatory maternity leave, both for the interest of women and the child. Of course, this is all falling apart, right? Many women don't breastfeed. There's surrogacy in some cases, which disconnects labor from mothering or parenting. So, and of course, to kind of argue for the special tie between mother and child seems deeply in tension with anti-stereotyping notions that are being put forward, as you said, including by Sorry, I'll do this. So where should we go? I mean, do you see
advantages to maybe having a mandatory paternity leave? Either in the interest of the tie with the child, which has been forever taken for granted when it was applied to women, but also maybe for the cause of gender equality, which should be a social cause that imposes, costs also. Like all the causes and all the social costs, there are, as you know, there's some case law, interesting case law at the European Court of Justice level that is showing its reticence to go down the path of disconnecting labor from maternity leave. It says, no, surrogacy, the surrogate mother gets the leave, not the mothering mother gets the leave. Where would you say we should go? I think it's the time to actually come forward and say, this is what I think should be happening.
Well, I think that having a compulsory paternity leave wouldn't be a bad idea, also because of a reason that hasn't been mentioned so far. Because I think if we look at the experience of compulsory maternity leave in Europe, and for instance we compare it to the US that has the opposite approach to maternity leave, meaning like there is no compulsory, it's optional, it's gender neutral, and so it's a completely different system. In Europe, one of the advantages of having like a compulsory maternity leave is that it has worked to somehow regulate the employee-employer relationship in the sense that women are protected from undue pressures from the employer. So they're free to take the leave. They're not afraid of being disadvantaged if they take the leave, or if they take like the full leave, the whole leave, not just a part of it. So I guess also like we could somehow apply the same reasoning to the case of compulsory paternity leave, because as I said, also here a big issue is the resistance from the side of employers. So having compulsory paternity leave could be also a way of regulating this kind of relationship, the one between employers and working fathers. So I guess, yeah, having compulsory paternity leave, like it's a good option. I mean, that's my opinion. Then, of course, I'm aware of like the side effects of this kind of measures, and so as I said before, like the European model, the European approach to family work reconciliation has also resulted in stereotyping, because by having something that is compulsory and is just compulsory for women, is associated, like reinforce the association between care and femininity. So I'm aware of like the criticism that has been brought forward towards any attempt to impose leaves on people. But I see it possibly as an intermediary phase, possibly as a way to somehow change the mindset of people, of society, of the employers, so that then at some point everyone would be ready to accept a father that is involved, that wants to be involved in the care of his child. And then at that point, possibly, we could step back, avoid having compulsory leaves, because we would be sure that people would still take it because it would be socially accepted.
So can I just say, at the risk of getting you all to throw things at me, that in the U.S. context, I have come out against this reflexive tendency to equal paternity leave, and said we need to really think carefully about what this leave is for. And Ruth, in your question, one of the things you were suggesting, which would be a perfectly reasonable thing to suggest, which is that paternity leave is for an opportunity for the father to bond with the child, which is very different from either the physical recovery from physical childbirth or the need to be the primary caregiver of a child. And until we as a society have clarified what leave is for, giving leave to men who all of the data, at least in the US, suggest are not the primary caregiver of their children, even when they're on leave, and certainly aren't recovering physiologically from childbirth, may, even in the views of the strongest American proponents of considering childbearing and child-rearing in anti-discrimination law, such as Joan Williams, may simply give more time off to men, leaving most of the, in particular, the unpleasant work of child-rearing in the hands of women. And that just increases the leisure gap that already is way too large between men and women.
Thanks. Yes.
Well, I was thinking about this parental leave and everything, and we were talking about the Swedish model that actually men can get the paternal leave, and it seems it's working. It's forcing them and it's pushing them to do the primary work of the kids. So I think compulsory paternal leave is kind of good. At least it changed a little bit the social context, and it changed the view that people have in this care of children. So I think it could be another thing. The other thing is that this compulsory maternal leave after the childbirth, it's assuming that all women are the same, and that all women feel the same, and that all women want to stay at home, and that all women have the same kind of pain and everything. And my experience is that not all women want to stay at home after birth. Sometimes they prefer to stay later, and they would prefer to have the husband at home at that time, and then they will go later. So I think we have to take into account that there's not just women and men as a group, that we have to remember, I think, that there is a diversity of women and men.
I think we also have to remember that there's a diversity of need for care, and one of the things that disturbs me is the almost exclusive emphasis on the period immediately after birth. And in the United States, there's this term, the sandwich generation. That is to say, that generation of particularly women, but also men, who are simultaneously caring for their young children and their elderly parents. This is something, I think, as the population ages, we're going to need to deal with more and more. And I also think, even with respect to young children, the very often planned for and welcome moment of their birth is not always the point at which they most need indulgence from the state and from their parents' employers, but rather at some later point in childhood or even in early adulthood, when they may be injured, when they may need family to turn to them to care.
No, I agree with what you said. And also, like, even if the Swedish example is always used and portrayed as a successful example, and it is in a way, there are also data showing that actually it's true that Swedish fathers take more parental leave because it's not transferable because of the system that Sweden has. However, it would seem that like a number of these fathers actually tend to take it around like holidays, for instance, around Christmas time, during summer. So according to some commentators, it would seem that it's true that they take it, but as you said, they don't necessarily use it to take care of their children, or like if they do it, possibly they do it together with the mother, so like they go on holidays all together. It's true, I mean, it's part of care, but it's true that it doesn't necessarily translate into a more engaged fatherhood practices. I agree. However, it seems to, and I also agree on the fact that it's true that it's not that children need care just after birth. I mean, the need for care might be even higher at a later stage. However, I guess that like these policies send messages inevitably. So it's true that you can rationalize them and say, well, in the end, possibly that's not the most important period, and they might need more care at a later stage. However, by having a compulsory maternity leave and having no EU directive on paternity leave at all, inevitably the European Union sends a message that is somehow reiterating a traditional division of labor in a way, even if it's just like concerning a specific period.
Yeah, I think I'm missing a class dimension in the discussion again. It's like it's not the same if you're a salesperson in a supermarket, and it's not the same if you're a doctor or a university professor. And I'm quite worried. I think, and saying this, I'm a mother of 4 children, and I have a very supportive partner. But there are many. I think like asking that the fathers take the maternity leave is not an answer to the problem, I'm afraid. First of all, because a mother is a mother and there are physical issues in this. Second, because I think in any case, parental leave that is taken for very long time, like the kind that is available in Scandinavia, is against your career. And I've been told this by colleagues from Denmark and Sweden, no matter whether you are a man or a woman. And hence, instead of talking of maternal or paternal leave, maybe we should talk generally about the how do we reconcile work and family. I think again we need, so like what you said, maybe it shouldn't be it shouldn't be obligatory to take maternity leave. I think this would be very dangerous for the middle, low skill occupations. It would be fine, again, if you're a top manager, if you're a top artist, if you are, a top doctor. Precisely would respond to your, it's been fine for me not having maternity leave. And I didn't have maternity leave for 3 out of the 4 children. But it was more felt like a choice. I can think of many cases where saying, okay, it is optional would be absolutely detrimental for women.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't state the contrary. Maybe I wasn't clear.
I have an answer to that as well, because you're mentioning that these parental leaves are destroying careers, but at the current moment they are destroying women's careers. So I think it's time for society to change the way it thinks about care, and also and it is about work-life balance as well, because for instance, if you look at Central and Eastern Europe and the directive that put now 1 month for men, well, 1 month for men when parental leave is 2 or 3 years is really not changing much, So I think it's also about employers becoming more flexible and, and just accepting this, as part of just changing the working environment. I think that's the...
So I'll also come back to the German abortion debate. virtually the only law that survived even a moment after the unification of Germany was the abortion laws, because of the strong commitment of East German women to their abortion rights. And it was not just their abortion rights they were committed to. They had been used to state-sponsored childcare that had not been available to West German women. And the failed promise of the German abortion compromise is that we will make a world for you in which abortion will not be the choice you are compelled to, because, for example, we will have more kindergarten places, we will have more childcare. That, unfortunately, although part of the broad general concept, was less fulfilled on the ground, and that seems bad to me.
This has, I think, been an extraordinarily rich debate. Before we all leave, I want to profit from the fact that there are so many lawyers in this room to ask a question that I can barely formulate, but which is implicit in all the talks, but which was brought up most clearly in Stefano's talk, which is, how does the law conceptualize the relationship between doing and being? And it seems to me that after the French Revolution, that gets conceptualized in exclusively gendered terms, and that before the French Revolution, it's conceptualized in much more complicated and non-universal ways around status, but that it's always the same question: what does it mean? What is the relationship between who you are and what you do? So that's one question that I think your paper raises. Another question is this issue about there have to be these two sexes because the polity in some way rests on the institution of heterosexual marriage. And that also is a fairly recent invention. It's, again, a post-1789, post-1776 in the United States invention. And so, you know, the idea that marriage is the critical political building block of the regime. And I think that your paper really poses those two questions in a very deep way, and I couldn't begin to imagine what the answer would be. I don't know if you've given some thought to this, Stefano.
Well, I begin from the last question. So heterosexual marriage is the very core of the law of gender assignment and reassignment. So, I mean, this emerges clearly. There is no discussion whatsoever about it. What people really freak out, especially judges freak out about, is that if you can change your gender at will, and if heterosexual marriage is the only form of marriage, then you can cheat the law of marriage. So I want to marry, I can't marry another man, but hey, I can become a woman, done. And this is something which is really, really concerning for the institution of heterosexual marriage. About the relationship between being and doing, like the formation of the model state has, as we know, involved a complete transformation of the relationship between the state of the individual. So the relationship, which was much more complex and way less direct before, became super direct. Yeah. But this implies that, that the state has to be able to read the individual. This is even more pressing, I think, with the introduction of the welfare state. Mm-hmm. So the state needs to understand individuals, needs to know that every individual does certain things because it has to provide for certain things to these individuals. And of course, the relationship between being and doing emerges clearly in this dynamic. Of course, in gender, but not only in gender, it emerges also in race. You know, well, infamously, the whole Nazi ideology was based on the idea that the Jews had assassinated Germany, stabbed Germany in the back. So the classification was something which they did. And also, if we think about that in the south of the US, white people were those people who were doing things of white people. And like black people were doing things typically of black people. And therefore, when Pakistani came and nobody really knew whether they were white or black, I said, okay, let's look at them. And they turned out some of them were doing things that were typically of white people. And so those ones were whites, the other ones no. And of course, I mean, this is hardly something new. It's like the theory of performativity by Judith Butler in the end. But the state has deeply relied on this theory of performativity because it has somehow to be able to read the individual. In the end, I'm not even that against this idea myself. You know, in the end, if we have to understand, if we have to provide facilities, we have to be sure that these facilities are, I don't know, rape safe, and therefore, if we know that 99.9% of the times are men who rape women, well, perhaps in those cases, we have to put men and women separated. So yeah, the relationship between being and doing is what I think characterizes the administrative state. This presumption of that certain people do certain things.
Does anybody want to comment on that, or should we call it a day? Well, thank you very much, all of you. And I'd like to thank our panelists for a really wonderful presentation.
The bus. Wait, I have to talk to the speaker.